Welcome to Hauser Wirth Somerset. My name is Vanagan and I'm the director here. We are absolutely delighted that you've joined us today to celebrate 10 years of learning. In 2014, we launched an ambitious learning program alongside the opening of our gallery in Somerset. Some of you were here for that event too. And we thank you for your commitment to working with us for this time and beyond. As we have grown the gallery locations over the last 10 years, the learning program has provided a vital template and has been a signifier of our success. The opening exhibition here was Phyllida Barlow's gig, and it is no coincidence that we celebrate her work with Unscripted this year, curated by the one and only Frances Morris. You will know Phyllida was both an artist and a teacher. We are grateful for the keen interest she took in our learning program and the support she gave to our activities over the years. Spearheaded by Manuela Wirth's commitment to art's transformative power, and that we can learn about the world through the work of artists, and led by Debbie Hilliard, our work now goes beyond Somerset. And we offer an ambitious global learning and partnership program bespoke to each of our locations. The Learning Exchange is a global initiative bringing together artists, museums, and gallery professionals as a discursive creative activity of sharing. Learning Exchange was launched last year in our new New York gallery located on 18th Street, which is dedicated to learning, editions, and publishers. And we will continue in New York in October with the following installment of the Learning Exchange titled Community Matters. Here in Somerset, we focus on our programs with schools and universities, our local partnerships, and the residency program. We will discuss much of this work in today's event. We also have a dedicated education lab, which for this show is in partnership with Bath University, and I hope you can pop in at some point throughout the day to see their great work. Today is intended as a celebration of some of our artists and partners, along with the experts who have helped make our learning programs grow and have provided fantastic opportunities for our audiences and the wider field of public engagement. As I mentioned in my introduction, Phyllida was an artist and an educator, sharing her time between her own practice and a commitment to the journey of students. Natasha Kidd is a practitioner and academic. Pedagogy is a huge concern for her, and she was also taught by Phyllida at the Slade. Natasha is joined by Henry Ward, director of Freelance Foundation, and a practicing artist who has done a series of residencies himself. We welcome them to share a conversation with us on all things practice and learning. Over to you, Henry.
Ashley. Thank you. Ashley, over to Tash, because you're going to start us off, aren't you?
I am, yeah. And I'm going to refer to my notes, otherwise there are things I'm definitely going to forget to say. Thanks for having us. So it's quite a kind of long question, but hopefully it will be clear why I'm asking it. In art practice as research, Graham Sullivan describes art practice as a complex system which incorporates a range of constituent activities as part of a dynamic learning life. I really love that, dynamic learning life. So to open our conversation, Henry, I'd be really interested in knowing what are the activities that make up what you do, who you are, and what is your practice?
Thanks, Tash. Okay, it is a long question. So I'm a painter, but I'm also an educator. And I've been involved in education for, I guess, probably over half my life now in different kind of contexts. And I'm now the director of Freelance Foundation, which is a charity that works predominantly with art education projects and programs and partners. So I guess all of those areas feed into one another in different ways and have done in different ways. And I think my sort of interest is in education as part of a kind of expanded idea of what artistic practice might be. So I don't see there being a distinct delineation between the work of the teacher and the work of the artist. And I think I wasn't fortunate enough to be taught by Phyllida, but I did have a period of time through the foundation where I worked quite closely with her on things. And one of the things I really enjoyed talking to her about was that bleed between those two areas of her own practice and the way in which work within a kind of educational context could feed into work within your own studio context and vice versa. So I think for me, I don't see teaching as a necessary evil to fund an artistic practice. I think it's part of one big thing. And I think particularly through the work of the foundation, since I've kind of come out of teaching, I guess in a more full-time capacity, I did that for a long time in schools and then also in art schools. I think working for the foundation, the opportunity to kind of facilitate programs or open up opportunities where these kinds of ideas are interrogated. So Tash and I work quite closely together on a program that the foundation set up 4 years ago, which is sponsoring fellows going into art schools across the UK. And the premise of that project is very much about placing practicing artists in art schools. We don't call them teaching fellows because the kind of academisation of higher education means if you call them a teaching fellow, they might have to go off and get something like a PhD before they're allowed to work with people, and that's nonsense. So the whole idea is to put practicing artists back in art schools and think about the kind of conversations that happen. And I think for me, it's that site of conversation maybe where everything comes together. So I can't remember your question word for word, but I'm going to throw it back and say, can you ask yourself the same question and tell us about your practice?
Yeah, I suppose, I think I'm probably going to pick up a bit on what you said, which is, I'm really interested, I suppose, more and more. And I think I've got kind of wiser to this about kind of understanding what the complexities of being an artist and thinking about a practice might be. So I am actually going to just list them because I think it's really also lovely to think about a kind of honest idea of practice, that it's not just the kind of hero version of being in the studio. So I do make things. I'm an artist. Actually, there's some of my machines. I was at the Slade I did BA and MA there, so I was lucky enough to be around Phyllida. And then I lived in Finsbury Park, so I've got kind of lovely, really wonderful memories. I make machines. Mostly I make them with others, so I'm really interested in that kind of the social. So I used to think they were kind of, I guess, distinct objects in their own right, but actually the more I make them and the more I've worked in teaching, the more I understand the objects I make as social. I work in a university, Bath Spa, no surprise. Actually, I used to run the Department of Art, but now I'm a new Associate Vice Provost. Sounds very posh. I've no idea what it means, around creative engagement. And actually what I've been really thinking about recently is how could I be an Associate Vice Provost and think about our creative engagement strategy as an artwork? How could I bring my practice and my process and myself to that work? We know each other because of, I guess, our history in gallery learning. I worked on the Baldessari learning. I made the Baldessari learning resource and the Boetti learning resource, the big Tate shows, and we met on a Tate project. So I've got a history of kind of that, working in that kind of gallery learning space, thinking about the learning resource as an artwork in itself, which I know is something maybe we'll touch on. This sounds like I do loads. I never sleep. So I run a project called Inventory of Behaviours with Joe Addison, who's another artist, where we've been since 2017 collecting the peripheral behaviours of artists. Phyllida's is on there. Fumble was Phyllida's. So we've got really interested in not the kind of not the production of work in its own right, but the kind of edges of what are at the edges of making. So what are the behaviours of artists when they're not making work? And maybe we'll talk a bit more about that. But I'm a mum of a 20-year-old now, 22-year-old. I'm a wife, I'm a sister. I'm a daughter of elderly parents. I'm a friend, a mentor. I've got a dog called Baxter. And I'm 51. And trying to be a 51-year-old woman in the world now and live well. And I think that's one of the things I really wanted to think about, that idea of the complexity of who we are and how that gets rolled, and how we might think of that as a kind of practice. I suppose the intersection between those kind of complexities. That's the answer to that question. But I might have a question.
Can I ask something there?
Yeah.
So I'm glad you mentioned inventory. I think for those of you who don't know inventory behaviours, I'd urge you to go and kind of look it up properly afterwards and investigate it, because it's an extraordinary growing project, isn't it, really? It's kind of archive, as Tash said, of these I guess, other behaviours in studios, really, isn't it? It's the not making behaviours. And I think actually progressively it's becoming I think it's quite a political project, in the sense that the pressure on studio practice, particularly in educational contexts, is one that we're seeing studios disappear. And we're seeing studios disappear from art schools, bizarrely, but we're also seeing studios disappear culturally, gentrification and the pushing out of artists and so on. And the idea of what happens within studio spaces, and I guess you said something about the hero in the studio. It's not about the hero in the studio, but there's something about studios that's quite, I guess, mythological, and sort of mysterious. The idea of making, and it doesn't fit with our kind of current obsession with how things get measured, behaviours in studios, and the reality of being in a studio. I mean, certainly the reality for me of being in a studio is not a lot of making. A lot of the time, there's a lot of reading. Drinking coffee, listening to music, being distracted largely by the internet, scrolling through things, having a bit of a sleep, moving work around, and not making. And all of those things are super important to making. And then when you put that into an educational context, I mean, I taught in secondary schools for 16 years, and the idea that a real art lesson in a secondary school might consist of people doing all the things I've just listed and not drawing, painting, or sculpting or something else would be impossible. Can you imagine Ofsted coming in and saying, well, this is a real art lesson, so actually everybody's scrolling on the internet, listening to music, having a chat, they're having a sleep. I mean, but that's actually what happens in studios, and all of that's a really important part of what being an artist is. So I think what's really exciting about inventory is the way it kind of unpicks that growing menu of activity. And I guess I'd be interested to know, you make these machines in the studio. I'd be really interested to know, what's the difference between your studio and the studios you find yourself teaching in, and how do those things operate?
Oh my God, there's loads in there that I want to think about. I really am interested in that kind of. I mean, oh God, there's too many things in that question, Henry. Okay, so inventory of behaviours is a collection of artist behaviours that celebrates, I suppose, or tries to make visible, as an artwork in itself, tries to make visible those kind of peripheral behaviours. And they could be resistant, they could be like, they could be around well-being, they could be around like, and there are over 400 of them written as instructions for others, actually. So they're really lovely that you can there are some behind us. And the project itself asks groups of young people or groups of artists to enact those behaviours, to kind of try to embody them in order to understand them as a kind of act of learning, I guess. Like, I'm really interested in that idea of you step into someone else's behaviour. Like, what does that do? It might remind you that, of the peripheral behaviours that you engage in. So that's what inventory is. And more, I think, for me, it's about a kind of recognition of, the studio. What is a studio? We may well be in a situation where we don't have kind of a 4 metre square space or a 3 metre square space or a 2 metre square space for a student. But what is it's a privileged space. And the universities are more and more kind of measuring how big that space is, and B, how productive one is in that space. And we have to make a call for not doing, because it's as or fumbling, and that those aren't things that we can measure, but they are crucially part of what's folded into learning and creativity. So, yeah, and I feel like, so in a way, I suppose inventory has become a kind of call to kind of emphasise not that kind of notion of productivity, that the studio as just a space of productivity, but it being the crucial space of rest, of looking after oneself, of like, in a moment where everything is about like data based on graduate outcomes or productivity, or, you know, that's both, we both know that through the kind of school system. So it's an artwork. I'm also really interested in kind of, I've got more and more interested in what I make, and inventory is something. I think of inventory as an artwork. It's a pedagogic event, it's a space of learning, but it's an active space of not knowing with others to try and work out what these behaviours might be telling us. The studio with students, you know, like I'm really interested in that space, like of that kind of trying to flatten the hierarchies, trying to be, you know, like the studio is a space of vulnerability, stepping into it with a student who is undoing themselves in front of you in a way, and what a privilege it is to be alongside that with them. And my studio is empty a lot because I'm a new associate vice provost. I go to breathe in it, like. It makes me anxious, and I adore it, and I pay for it because I can now, and some of our students will leave and maybe never make again. And I think it's maybe like, what is it to have that conversation with them? But there's that space of the 3-year undergraduate degree where they are in making and the value of being in those processes. And then I'm going to ask you something, which is a bit about the fellowship, I suppose. Like, so we've got a freelance fellow. In fact, 2 of our freelance fellows are here. It's been unbelievable to kind of support. Henry, tell us more about the freelance fellowships, because they're really critical. And what they've done is they've placed an artist in the site of the art school, but not as an academic, not as a student, that lovely space between. And it's been so rich for all of us involved in it. Like, I've learnt so much from the freelance fellows that have come to us at Bath Spa. It's like refreshed my kind of, and I love that. I've loved it. I've loved what I've seen as they've kind of worked with our students. They've exposed these practices. I've loved being alongside them as they've taught me things, brought new references. But I'm really interested in the kind of driver behind that. And
yeah, I mean, I don't think it's particularly innovative or original in lots of ways. I think it's one of those things where I think we're guilty in lots of contexts in the world, but particularly in education and I've got a colleague here, and we're going to cover ground we covered yesterday morning here around this idea of a search for some kind of utopian ideal of what education might be. And there's always a sense that you build and you do the next new thing and the new thing, and eventually you're going to come up with the answer. And I think that's rubbish, actually. So I think what the fellowships was about was looking back to things that used to happen. And what used to happen when I was at art school was there were fellowships, and people would leave art school and then they'd go back into art schools as newly graduated artists who were fumbling, that word, trying to work out what being an artist was. And what was great about being an undergraduate and down the corridor there being somebody 4 or 5 years ahead of me, or 5 or 6 years ahead of me, who was trying to work it all out, was they weren't a lecturer and there wasn't an academic pressure, and there was this sense of a different kind of relationship. I remember the conversations I had as an undergraduate painting student with a painting fellow were just extraordinary, because you sort of had a hint that this was you a little bit further down the line, and it felt like you were having conversations about, in my context, what painting was about. And that was really interesting, and it didn't feel, no matter how hard you try and flatten the hierarchy, I mean, you've got a title with provost in it, which is really scary. You know, I mean, the only provost I know is in a game called Sillis, and basically the provost catches up with you, and if they catch up with you, you're in real trouble. So that's your role, which is terrifying, no matter how nice you are, right? So, but the fellow is different. The fellow's in that kind of, as you described, it's like an in-between space. So they're not a student anymore, but they're not quite in that. They're not a lecturer either. So I think there's something really interesting about operating in that kind of transitional space, I suppose. But really the emphasis was about putting artists who make, and there is a political, you know, I said inventory is political. I think the fellowships are political, because I think that, you know, there's quick potted history of what's happened to higher education. So, you know, the Polytechnics Act at the end of the 1960s meant that further education and higher education colleges amalgamated to become polytechnics. And as Patrick Heron wrote in 1971 in a brilliant article in the Guardian called Murder of the Art Schools, no artist would ever run a polytechnic because they weren't interested in all these other subjects. So you had people running polytechnics with what used to be art schools in them, and then homogenizing how things worked across disciplines. So art schools had to behave like other subjects. And then along come the Tories under Thatcher and decide that it would be a really progressive thing to do to make all polytechnics be able to apply to be universities. And by becoming universities, then polytechnics had to behave the same as universities behave. So suddenly you have art subjects having to behave like history or maths or languages. And maybe they shouldn't have to behave like that. But what it means is that there's this enormous pressure on people working in art schools to be academic. So the need to have a PhD, the need to be actively researching. And then in some cases, universities only recognising that active research in a very narrow academic way. I'm not suggesting Bath is doing that, but lots of universities do. You know, you have to publish and you have to be in journals. And whether you're practicing as an artist in a studio, it's kind of no longer what's needed. So my concern on a really basic level was, have we got a generation of young people going to art school who actually are talking to people who've forgotten what it is to make, or can't make because they're so busy with other things they're having to do? So partly putting the fellows into art schools is about saying, what happens if you put somebody who's still making art, but they're a bit further ahead next to young people who are working out how to make art? So it's quite simple, but I think it's brilliant listening to how much you've got out of it and how much Bath has got out of it. And I know, you know, we have, as you said, two fellows here, one of whom has remained as a member of staff at Bath and is our kind of at the vanguard of this, not to embarrass her too much, but is this sort of the model of this. Wow, imagine if fellows went into art schools and then stayed in art schools and taught in them, and we have somebody who's done that. And I think it is really exciting seeing where the learning is happening. And having set that project up 4 years ago, I don't think we could have anticipated how much symbiotic mutual learning there would be, you know, and listening to the fellows, the current fellows and ex-fellows talk about what they learn. I don't know if I was even, when we set it up, thinking, well, what will the fellows learn by doing this? Or what will the institution learn by doing this? But I think all participants are learning from one another. And actually, you know, that, in a way, that goes back to something, drawing back to Phyllida again, something she used to talk about, why she taught for so long, partly was because of that kind of symbiotic thing. It's not one-way traffic. You know, when you're teaching, it's not Socratean. It's not about standing on a stage like this and having all the knowledge and sharing it with tabula rasa in the audience who are all just going to listen. It's actually interactive. You know, as a teacher, if you're doing it well, you learn as much from your students as they learn from you. And that idea of that sort of discursive space where ideas are shared and developed, I guess that's at the foundation of what we wanted the fellowships to do.
Yeah, I mean, the fellows for us have really, like, I was thinking like a lot last night about this idea of like the gatekeeper of art, you know, like, or the kind of, as the head of art in an institution, or like, and then like, how do you really ever flatten those hierarchies? And like, how do you kind of go in, like, how do you, we all do at Bath talk about our own work to our students, and I now talk about like all of that kind of complex, the kind of things that I feel like are folded into what I, you know, the practice. I was thinking, you know, back to being, actually what I wanted to do for 1 minute was bring it back to gallery learning, you know, like, and some of the, like, not that I want to romanticize a moment, but like there was a real, like, I felt really privileged to be invited as an artist. You know, I worked with Jenny Lomax at Camden Art Centre, who just championed practicing artists in learning, and what it was to bring your own practice to the site of another practice, to kind of, and maybe offer then that through a kind of learning resource up to others, to situate people inside art, but through your own practice. So it wasn't like the instrumentalization. It was a kind of, there was something incredibly exciting. And I've, worked with the teachers, teaching and learning curators at Tate now, and there's still so much amazing work. And I was thinking about, so I suppose what I was interested in, that notion of kind of reciprocal learning, with the groups you're with the fellows you work with the students, but with other practice, so I felt like, to be inside the Boetti show, or to be inside that Baldassare show, to try to understand it, to then expose that thinking to others in the form of a learning resource, was like the best thing ever.
But the way that you're describing that feels, and you say it in a way it's romantic, because you are talking about something that happened a while ago, and I wonder how much this is happening now, because I think there is something in gallery education in particular where there's so much pressure to produce and offer an offer. That this is what we can give for others, rather than seeing that as being a reciprocal learning relationship. And I think what was brilliant about that period that you described, Tash, is it felt like it was gallery education as artistic practice, less an offer. We're a gallery, we're going to offer these things for people to come and participate in. It was a recognition of different expertises coming together and trying to find something out and fumble around. And I think that's really interesting. And as the foundation that I run is also a funder. And one of the things we're often interrogating when we have people approach us for funding is how little people are prepared to look for the expertise. And I would say particularly with teachers, it's very often, this is what we can do for teachers. I always read that as this is what we can do to teachers, which as an ex-teacher worries me a little bit. And I think, what about what you can do with teachers? And where's the bringing the teachers in and the artists in, and those voices being genuinely shared? And I mean, I won't name the institution because it would be really unfair, but I was in a meeting fairly recently with a big national organisation, gallery, museum, who were talking about what sounded like an extraordinary project they wanted funding for, but they were talking about the difficulty they were having with sending this curator actually going into schools, because they didn't have the experience of working with young people that perhaps they needed, and they were talking about how difficult it was. And I said, why don't you use the experts that with the young people? And they said, who? They actually said, which experts? I said, well, every time you go into the school, you're working with people who are spending their entire lives working with young people. Maybe you could ask them. And honestly, it was like it had never crossed their mind that they can actually work with the teachers directly to develop the program. I said, and maybe your curator would learn loads from the teachers that are in the school. And then you could have this, forget working with the kids, work with the teachers and the creators and the artists together. You could build an amazing program. And they said, well, that'd be a lot cheaper too. It's like, yeah, no shit, so it's kind of, it is, I do think we're in a strange space at the moment. And I think there was a time, when we first met was about 2009, 2010, something like that. And it was at that point, it was an extraordinary project that Tate ran called Insight of Conversation, that was about bringing together artists and art educators and different cohorts and using the resources, largely the archive at Tate, to kind of try and unpick and think, what could you do? And what I remember about that project was, it was so open-ended. Nobody said, this is what we're going to produce. It was just, should we see where we get to? And I think we ran it for like 14, I remember going to the Tate for sort of 14 months or something every few weeks. And nobody ever said, what are you going to make? It was just, let's see where we got to. And I thought, that was an amazing time, But
it's interesting, isn't it? Because in a sense, I suppose, it also gave, I was thinking, I feel really proud to work in learning. I do actually really remember a moment of people when I was a student, not talking about working in learning programs, because it was almost like the way to it was the way you might make money so you could go to the studio.
Necessary.
Yeah, and actually, what I don't know, maybe, and I do recognise it's a kind of privilege. There was a privileged moment, and it's a privileged position to be in. But I feel really proud to say that actually my practice is at what I make is a kind of all about learning. You know, like I don't feel like I do a practice over there, you know, make these objects, maybe work on a, you know, a gallery project over there and work in the university over there. Like I want to celebrate and also celebrate that kind of the equality of all of those activities. And I think, I really truly hope that's what we do to the students that come through our undergraduate degrees at Bath. And it may not be that they will go and operate in those spaces of learning, but that the processes and the spaces of kind of like not knowing and the vulnerable space that the studio enables, and that type of having no idea like what the question is and how to answer it in the space of a studio or what to do, and equips them with this kind of set of kind of skills and a kind of ability to be in the world that they take to any, you know, and that they take into any career. And I'm not talking about a kind of professional development or kind of, and there's loads of interesting kind of conversations to have around that kind of idea of professionalisation. But I want us at Bath Spa to really celebrate those processes, but then really talk openly about that actually to not make again, to not have a studio again, does not mean you've failed. Like actually, though you might have had this wonderful experience, this 3 years of being inside art and inside making, and then taken all of that way of being in the world and way of learning it with you. And I really want to, I think as kind of, it's our job also to talk a bit more honestly about that as studio spaces, you know, as the in order to be more honest for those graduates as they kind of move into a very different world than the ones we moved into post our undergraduate degree.
I think that's brilliant, because I think you're right. And I remember, you know, as an art student, if you weren't talking about leaving and going either to do an MA or going into a studio practice, then at that point nobody was interested in talking to you. If you dared mention you were interested in education, you were sort of, you were just sidelined, which is outrageous. How are we doing, Alan?
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe I'll ask you a question about your studio. I suppose I want to go back to that. Can you describe the studio, the importance of this space to you, to art pedagogy?
Oh, blimey. All right. Well, really quickly. So interestingly, based on what you were just saying, I think there's been periods in my life when my practice has been much more amalgamated with the other things I was doing. So very quickly, as a secondary school teacher, I kind of accidentally got promoted to be a deputy head teacher. So it's a school of about 2,000. It was accidental.
I got accidentally promoted to associate vice president.
Well, exactly. Yeah, it didn't have such a sexy title. But as deputy head teacher, I was given options, curriculum, timetable, behaviour policy, Key Stage 5, drama, dance, music, DT, fine art, etc., and science. And I think actually I was given all those things so that I would hand in my notice. But I went home and I thought, if you give somebody options, timetable and all of that, you've actually just given them the school. So although I wasn't the head, and then I thought, what if I turned the school into my practice as an artist? So I went and read everything I could and worked out. It's all sorts. This is still the case. This is extraordinary. There is nothing from government that tells you have to call subjects the names we call them at school, but everybody calls them the same names, which is kind of interesting. And there's also nothing that tells you how many hours you have to teach things, just what you cover. So I went away and I did things like made up subjects. So I combined science and art and called it Sci-Art. And instead of employing science teachers, because we couldn't employ decent science teachers, employed art teachers, but gave them lab coats and got them to teach science in art classrooms with no science knowledge. And it transformed science in the school. And we taught drawing as a cross-curricular subject, and we launched a magazine, and we ran a gallery, and we did all sorts of things. And that was when my practice completely, I didn't really have a studio then. I felt like the school was my studio, and everything happening in the school was my studio. But actually, now I would say I feel like I've betrayed myself slightly, because now I definitely have a studio that I go to. And you said earlier you go to the studio to breathe. and I definitely do that. But I have 2 sites that I make in, and one is my shed, because then I can go there every day because it's a few yards from my kitchen door, and I can paint in the morning before work or late at night or whatever. And then I have a studio I go to do all the things I was talking about earlier, like drink coffee, look out the window, browse the internet and listen to music. So that's sort of where those things sit. But I still think for me, the teaching, I maintain bits of teaching, because for me, the teaching studio is really important. The space of making. You said earlier it was a privilege to go into somebody's space and talk to them, and the exposing the student. I think that's really true, and I really like people coming into my studio for the same reasons of that sort of raw conversation. So I think I don't really think I've answered your question, but I did tell an amusing story about ripping up a curriculum in the school, so maybe that's a good point to end on.
Actually, I think there's a really interesting point there as well to end on, which maybe is just to recognise where we are. Which is, if schools, which I'm sure there are people that work in schools here, and universities, are more and more kind of governed and squashed, and maybe these spaces, this space, these are the spaces that I guess I was frightened of romanticising a moment, but these spaces do exist, and they're not just simply about the kind of, and Phyllida epitomises that, these are the spaces where maybe that more risky work, maybe those kind of we have to kind of celebrate, and these are the spaces that can maybe do that work when, as the schools and the universities kind of, I guess I was just wanted to say that spaces of learning in those galleries, spaces of learning in these are crucially important. Opening up access to art in the way that they are doing. Yeah.
That's a nice point to end on. Yeah. Promoting where we are and everything, and being
unscripted. No. Has anyone got any questions?
We have a roaming.
Roaming mic.
You want to speak next to you?
Thank you so much. I wanted to touch on that point about practice-based learning, in gallery spaces. I'm not from an arts history background. I did politics at uni, but I actually lived with a lot of people who were studying primary teaching and were as frustrated at how much time they were spending in classrooms learning about classrooms rather than in classrooms with children and young people learning about teaching. And I was thinking about it a lot when I recently went back to visit some of my family. We went to an artist talk, and it was really fascinating. This is an artist practicing in ceramics, and she also writes poetry. And at the end of the talk, my mum, not from an arts background, turned to me and said, I would have never called this person an artist. I would have said they were an academic or a researcher, to the point about the academicization of art practice. And I wanted to ask more constructively what we can be doing to support people, practitioners who do have interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary practices. And I think especially those who have a socially or politically engaged practice that does, it does touch on historic themes, let's say, without expecting these people to be doing perhaps a historical reckoning that institutions, whether they're academic or arts-based, often expect of people who come in.
Great.
Sorry, very long.
It's a really great question.
Can I have first stab at that? I think it is about. I'm sort of cautiously optimistic. We might be at a point where this is about to be a little bit more possible again. Just politically, maybe the door's opening a little bit, and maybe differences can come in again. I think. I'm going to answer it by giving an example of how I think that kind of thing can happen. And this is an example of an artist. It was a Belgian artist called Jeff Gies, who worked for, I think, about 35 years in a through school in a little town in Belgium. And his title, I think, was Director of Aesthetics or Provost of Prosthetics, maybe. It's aesthetics. But his role was that he could do whatever he wanted as an artist within the school, and he had somebody who worked alongside him who was responsible for documenting whatever he went off to do and representing him at meetings if he didn't want to go to the meeting because he wasn't interested in going to the meeting. And I think that's kind of, we need more Jeff Gies, because I think we need more people given that kind of role, so he could carve things out. So he did extraordinary things, like he worked with the children to paint a map of the world on the playground with good references, so that they could come in the morning and they could bring news stories in, and then they would talk about what happened in the world, but they'd use the playground to go and find out where there was. But then the geography teacher at the school accused him of stepping on his toes and teaching them geography, and I think that's really quite interesting. So I think we need more Jeff Gees type roles. I think we need more people with, like, minister without portfolios in schools that probably have an artistic background, that just wander around doing interesting stuff, and it's all right. And I think that would be really progressive.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I was thinking, talk about it more, say those things out loud more. Like, you know, I mean, not that I'm like here to big up Bath Spa or anything, but like, actually, you know, they have taken a risk putting an artist in the senior leadership team. You know, like I really like, you know, so that's about having, you know, a vice chancellor who is like willing to kind of, you know, so it's like willing to take a risk to put someone that might be someone who prods at things in a slightly different way, you know, and I think that is what we need. We need, you know, so, or thinking about Policy Lab, you know, the work that Policy Lab are doing, like, so it's kind of putting artists with these social practices, talking about it more, like, yeah, like just saying it out loud more, I guess, privileging it. Is that an answer to the question?
On that note, and listening to and looking at the inventory of behaviors, is there some way to use all this information to collectively support these artists, whether through your inventory of behaviors or other outlets where all these frustrations that we're talking about that they're having, they'd find that there's more of a community that they can address together?
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, there are people like Paula Orell, and like, I feel like there are people knocking at the door, and like, I mean.
Yeah, and I think there's also, you were talking about the space we're in as being maybe a site in which these things can happen, and I think there's also an interesting rise in so-called alternative models of art education, which often feel like they're about peer support, and they're less about hierarchy, they're more about people wanting to come together and talk about these things. So I think, I don't know, maybe this is a romantic idea. I feel like the more adverse the situation becomes, the more likely we are to self-organize and do that. And I think that actually when things are hard, people kind of, I don't know, they sort of join forces. And I think I feel like that whilst in some ways I feel quite pessimistic about it all, I think I also feel optimistic because I feel like people talk to one another a lot more about it than they did.
And it's interesting, you know, it's really interesting saying that. Like, I was in a meeting the other day about recruitment, fine art at Bath, you know, and actually across, I've got friends in other, they were really buoyant, like, figures for students applying into those courses. That I know, you know, that might be over as we've seen a kind of total the problems in schools around creative subjects. But it's actually kind of interesting being in the space of the art school, isn't it? Everyone wants to analog make, they want to be in ceramics or like in woodwork, learning these skills. They want to be in studios, like, and they're knocking, you know, they are applying to these courses that you think actually, like, it's interesting that, you know, you sit in a senior leadership team, in a senior leadership meeting where one of the only courses that could have over-recruited this year was a fine art course. And that's hugely, like, a relief, you know, that more artists will graduate from those spaces and they will go into the world. And they might go into the world and never make a thing again that looks like art, but they'll take that kind of learning into those spaces that so I feel I've usually got a necklace that says hope because I'm forever hopeful.
I think that's probably more artists going out into the world is definitely where we want to see at the end of a panel like that. So I think, thank you, Natasha and Henry.
So just to introduce this next session, I just want to start off by saying that in 2013, so 1 year before we opened the gallery here in Somerset, the artists Bjorn and Otter Roth, Pippa Rist, and Guillermo Quitka all came to Somerset. They embarked on a unique experience to help build the core foundations of our gallery here and began our residency program in Somerset that still continues today. Our residencies are the outcome of Ivan and Manuela Wirth and Mark Peo's approach to fostering opportunities for artists, something they've always done but has become more visible here in Somerset. Over the last 11 years, artists including Phyllida Barlow, Rashid Johnson, Barty Kerr, and Christina Qualls have spent an extended period in Bruton, drawing inspiration from Durslade Farm, the local culture, and the surrounding landscape. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome back artist Allison Katz, who was in residence with us in 2023, so last year, and also writer Leela Keshav, who was our writer in residence earlier this year. They're joined by our senior curatorial director, Tanya Barson. So over to you guys.
Thank you very much. So we're going to have I hope, an informal conversation, a flowing conversation about residencies. I have a few questions, but hopefully we'll get a little bit unscripted during this. I wanted to start by asking both of you, from your perspective as an artist, a painter, and as a writer, what you think the value of residencies are and what opportunities they provide. Maybe if Allison, yes.
I think the main thing that I have not done many residencies, but every time I have felt as though I am being trusted. So whether that means I will produce a lot or I will store up for future ways of working, there's something about being given the trust. That's the thing that I would just say is why they're so crucial to, at some point, go on one or participate in one.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think also as a kind of young emerging writer who really had no experience doing a solo residency, at least, this was, kind of a huge amount of trust that was put into me. And I guess coming here was quite a scary experience in a way, where I felt kind of like an imposter and like, what am I doing here? Like, I don't know what I'm going to even be producing or writing. I think just finding such a supportive, encouraging and nurturing environment here, where I felt trusted to just kind of experiment and explore without really any pressure. That was such a privilege, and it was really just about being given a space to think about things and meet people and think about what it even means to do a residency. So I think, it was a wonderful experience in that regard.
Maybe partly inspired by the previous panel, I wanted to also ask both of you, what does your day look like? What, as an artist, as a painter, as a writer, taking on this residency, what activities do you engage in within that working day as part of the residency? How does it form? How does it shape?
Well, I did what I do in my own studio. I just did it here. But the one thing I had here was space. So I made each room of the studio into a different zone, because previously I was in one room. So in one I moved sort of the computer and that everyone knows what I mean, that bit there. And then I had the paintings, and then I had ceramics, and then I had works on paper, and then I even had enough space to lay out my books. So I sort of used the space as a chance to not necessarily compartmentalize, but organize differently, so I could almost see all the things that go into painting. Because I sort of understand painting to be one of many activities, but it is the culmination, it is the sensibility through which I would filter other forms of research or thinking. But this was the first time where normally, whilst it's all in one room and it's very messy, in this case, I just had the chance to be almost neat. You know, I was very tidy, which was exciting. And I could turn things away. I could leave things out. There was, for me, really getting out of the city and having all this kind of space was mirrored also by leaving things and not finishing just because I had a very small studio. So you didn't have this sense of being able to have a lot of peripheral vision.
I think for me, I wanted to explore writing as a kind of situated practice. And so for me, it was very much about being out in Bruton and around the gallery and just walking as part of my writing practice and talking to people. And I think the first thing I did on my first day was go to the local museum and just talk to the woman who worked there. And she had grown up in Bruton and knew so much. I just felt the sense of everything around me was interesting and kind of was sparking ideas of things I wanted to explore further and write about. And so it was kind of talking to people and walking and observing, and then writing outside as well was something I was trying, and then writing inside. And I think I did the residency while I was doing a master's in architecture, and so I think writing was always and is like part of an interdisciplinary practice, I guess. So I didn't have a very rigid schedule of like, okay, I wake up at this time and I write for 3 hours. It was more ad hoc, I think, and kind of being carried by things I was interested in, or even the weather and what I wanted to see and think about that day.
And so was there place within these residencies for the unexpected, for the disruptive, for the challenging, and how did that impact on your working practices?
Well, I was preparing for an exhibition. So, and I was meant to stay 2 months, and then it was going to be 3 months, and then it became 6 months. So I benefited greatly from chance, from being here in the winter, just wasn't as popular, let's say, from the rainiest winter in like 100 years. So I wasn't tempted to really be outside. But what I also had, this exhibition was actually in Los Angeles. So I had this extreme differentiation of place where I was not in London, I was in Somerset, but I was actually thinking about Los Angeles. So I had these, and then I was able to sort of draw out pieces of each place and talk about how painting has, for me anyway, also the ability to sort of think about, be about one place while you're thinking about another and another. So there was a way to actually use the experience physically of being somewhere, of thinking about somewhere else, and how that is a way of thinking about how to make an image. It's not quite located precisely. So whilst I was very local on one hand, I was also completely elsewhere. And I was also doing a research project about Pompeii at the time, starting to gather that. And then it turns out 20 minutes from here is an entirely reconstructed Roman villa that was found on an archaeological site. And it was truly bizarre, that I had just been in Pompeii looking at all the fragments, and then 20 minutes down the road here was like the Disney World of Pompeii, like Las Vegas, kind of the whole thing reconstructed down to the shoes. So I kept feeling like wherever you are, there's going to be other places that enter, and it was just catching and collecting all these coincidences that, because you're not at home, you're very heightened. I mean, the first painting I made too was the view out the window in my apartment in London, because I wasn't there. So this displacement to me was also the benefit of being somewhere else, but it was how you think about other places.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think for me, it was very much about being in Bruton, and just, I didn't have any other projects I was working on at the time. So it was kind of a self-contained 2 weeks just to be here and think about this place and write with these different actors and elements in the landscape and in the town. And I think because of that, I came without really any preconceived ideas, and I was just like, let's just see what happens. And so it was all about kind of disruptions and unexpected things that were coming from it. I also explored the Roman villa, and I ended up being sort of taken in by the local historian and his family, and that ended up shaping the residency so much, because then he was taking me places and taking me on walks and describing his knowledge of the local history, and these are all things that I really had no idea going into the residency. And I think I think for me at least, going in with that openness and just willingness to learn and receive and learn from other people was very important.
So being open to new experiences. How did the very specific circumstances of being at Hauser Wirth in Somerset on this kind of campus with an art gallery and exhibiting space, how did that impact on the residency on the one hand, and on the other, as you've touched on a bit, the rural location of this art campus, as it were, or farm?
Well, I would say the biggest shift that happened for me was that people did have to come into the studio. And normally when you're in your own studio, no one has to come if you don't let them. And it was something I didn't expect to enjoy, which was that people were coming in and seeing work that was unfinished. And prior to this, I was very protective of work that wasn't finished, except for very few people that I felt comfortable to let into my process. The sequence of sort of different kinds of visitors, even just being around those who work in the gallery here, I got used to people seeing what I was working on when I wasn't, quote, finished. And then I just gave up all that control. And I thought, oh, maybe it is interesting for people to see the process. I don't know why it really didn't occur to me before that it might be interesting. I truly did not think that anyone would want to see unfinished works. I think that sometimes there is also ideas people have about studios and studio life, but I wasn't really, to me, that wasn't interested in sharing that. And that got sort of broken down when I was here. I let in different visitors and also some school groups. And by the end of it, I was like, I don't care. Just look around. I stopped being so precise about the showing part. And I realized that people can come into a studio and get inspired, and it has nothing to do with me or what I'm doing in particular. It's just the atmosphere of the studio, because in some ways when it's your everyday and with your own friends or colleagues who are doing it too, you forget that actually it is a place that has a lot of possibility. So I was really grateful, weirdly, to kind of lose that self-consciousness around finish and process and kind of protecting those different pieces. I really didn't expect that that would be such a positive outcome.
I think for me, the scale of Bruton and I guess the kind of welcoming attitude everyone had was really important and helpful, because I was here for 2 weeks, and I think if I had been in a much larger city, I would have felt really overwhelmed, especially with the kind of brief that I'd set out for myself. But being kind of on this one main street and walking up and down, I felt like I knew the place even after 2 weeks, and it felt like I really was able to develop a connection to it. And then even to the gallery, it was kind of closed to the public at the time because they were installing the Phyllida Barlow. And so there's almost this sense of like being able to see behind the scenes and having access to the garden when it was completely closed. And I came once and I was the only one in the whole garden. And I felt like this trespasser, but it felt very exciting. And I was just like lying on the big rocks. And then I started writing about the rocks. And I don't know, it was, yeah. I think, yeah, the fact that it was closed actually made it a completely different experience than it would have been otherwise if it had been full of visitors.
For me as a curator, having access to someone else's working environment is incredibly important, and it's the observation. I think there is something to do with it could be any working environment and you're just seeing the mechanics of something in process that is very inspiring. But I think there's also an element of learning particularly about that practice and the specificity of that practice that is incredibly key, but also a real privilege. I wonder about the dynamics between that sort of the circumstances of deconstructing your own practice and kind of self-learning, self-guided learning, and how you interact with different audiences through the process of the residency. And I wonder if you could both talk about your interactions with different audiences that come here to Somerset and how that worked with your residences here.
Good question, but sometimes I don't know if it matters. Because when someone comes in and they have a question, you're just in the present with that person asking the question. And I was amazed by some of the questions the teenagers asked when they came. They were just as informed or just as kind of direct to me as questions that curator or another artist or someone working at the gallery would ask. So I don't think I have any particular insight in that, in the sense that any visitor comes, it always puts the artist a little bit, you're awake, you're more aware as well of your work because someone is looking and you are looking at that person looking, and that's a very different sort of form of awareness. But I don't really think it matters, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I think maybe going back to what the previous speakers were talking about, this kind of mythology of this studio, and I think I was quite intimidated by the mythology of the kind of solo residency and this feeling of kind of the lone writer artist working in isolation. And I didn't really want to, I mean, I was doing that in a way, but I didn't want to engage with it so much. I wanted to kind of think about ways to encourage collaboration even within an individual residency. And I think that was through framing writing as a writing with practice. And even though the gallery was closed, I had kind of wonderful interactions with people working at Hauser Wirth and with locals. And then I was also thinking about writing with kind of more than human beings in the landscape, and thinking about writing as a kind of collaboration between me and the kind of situation of the residency and the people around me and the trees around me and the plants and the river, all being kind of writers marking the kind of landscape and town in their own way. So
that's so nice, because in some ways I was happiest when I did not leave the house to the studio. It's like there's a driveway between the two, and there was like a week probably I just went house, driveway, studio, like back and forth. And I couldn't believe like the non-commuting, the commerce, you know, just not engaging in anything of the day-to-day, you know, not having a wallet or, you know, the phone, but really it was just about going from the bed to the coffee to the studio and back. And I knew, because it was a finite experience as well, like that is not sustainable either. But when you know that you are in a sort of moment of difference, for me the difference was actually not engaging, and as much as possible trying to understand how a little bit of slow, like a real slowdown, how much pressure still exists in the act of doing or making, but at least it was framed differently and you could hear it differently or something.
So more like a retreat almost, to taking yourself away from the everyday pressures of life, but not the pressures of making in terms of, you know, being productive within the studio. But is productivity really, what part does that play within these residencies?
Well, each residency is different. And like I said, I've only done 4. But the first one I did when I was 23, it was a Canadian residency in in Visby, in Gotland, in this tiny island in Sweden, in the Baltic, and there was nothing. You were literally like airdropped, and there was an outhouse. I didn't know anything about it. And it was so intense and isolated that it was amazing, but it was scary. It was almost like too isolated. And then I was very lucky to do a residency in Hauser Wirth's studio in Spoleto in Italy and work literally in his studio. And there was 5 of us there. And that was almost perfection in terms of the balance of history, of intimacy with a place, of kind of meeting just the right amount of people around you. So in each case, there was something about productivity or production that got challenged or really responded to length of time. But I like the idea that you have to work a little bit, even if you don't want to, because it's also a chance to push through some of those doubts about what you can do in this time. So I sort of really do enjoy working even when I don't want to in a specific place. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I think because of the limited time, there is this pressure that exists. And also the residency is sort of a gift to you, and you feel almost like an obligation to give back in some way. I think that really stressed me out when I first came, and I was like, what am I going to do? Like, what if I have writer's block and I don't know? But then when I came, and this was the first writing residency Hauser Wirth has done, and they told me that it was more of like a test for both of us, just to give me this space, and I didn't really have to come out with a book or like even an essay, or even they were asking for 1,000 words. I was like, okay, I think I can manage 1,000 words. And there were some days when I didn't even write that much because I was so busy like talking to the local historian and visiting the Roman villa and walking, and then I'd come back and be like, oh my gosh, I haven't even written. But then I think I realized that actually that was also part of the writing process, like you were talking about with the kind of peripheries of practice. And I think taking the time to do not writing then really helped me write. And then often sitting in Stockwell House, sometimes that was a productive space, but often I would just start to feel cooped up, and then taking a walk, and then suddenly having so many more ideas and wanting to write again. That was, yeah.
I thought that part of the previous panel talking about the other kinds of activities was really interesting, and I think that we can all identify with that as part of our working process, and the kind of procrastination, the role of doubt that you mentioned. I know, Allison, that you were also going to collect books in the local environment here, and that became a part of the practice.
It's true. There are some amazing book fairs that I found, and secondhand bookstores, all the things that don't exist in London in the same way, very inexpensive, ephemera. So yeah, we found the book fair person circuit and a few book dealers and these village hall book fairs, and so much material there. That was really fun. Also because it's very treasure hunty, and you could find like magazines from the 30s and 40s, like there was lots of kind of, let's say, printed matter and ephemera that reflected different histories, different places, but a concentration of it in this area that was very exciting. I didn't even realize I liked it so much. Not sure my husband liked it as much as me. Spent hours at these country book fairs, but yeah, there's like lots of different subcultures. I mean, I don't know if it's a subculture necessarily, but like these gatherings of people who are united by collecting. There's also the Shepton flea that was a revelation, the largest flea market I've ever seen in my life. So I think there was ways to look at objects differently as well, that is away from the very particular commerce of the city.
Yeah, the opportunity for different kinds of encounters that come from being in a very different location to your ordinary lives. So I think probably we can open up now to questions.
Hi there. This one's for Allison. really loved your poster designs for the Gruppenausstellung.
Thank you.
Is that a pronunciation of the
Yeah.
show, previous one? Can you explain that practice, the digital side, I would imagine, in relation to your painting? And did the kind of the book material, did any of that kind of go into those poster designs?
Yeah, that's actually, thank you for bringing that up, because while I was here, they were preparing for this very large group show, and I was invited to make some posters because making posters is something I've done for maybe a dozen years, and it definitely satisfies a certain graphic sensibility and desire that I can't put into the painting, and does come from my love of sort of printed matter and ways of communicating with images that are not necessarily through oil paint or paint. So I don't know how we kind of devised it, but basically I was invited to make posters, and that was my way of making a little bit of a visual diary of what was going on. Because I think there was 12 in the suit, and I was actually finding it very satisfying to contain all of this research. I mean, I don't really like the word research, actually. I think the notebook quality or the ephemera of being here and of finding things and of thinking, like, how could it also remind myself of the event, of being here, of the exhibition, of this particular collection of time. So the posters ended up, I mean, I think I was asked to make one, and I made 12. So that's also my own way of finding other outlets to kind of mark the time I was here. Because I did start a lot of paintings that I didn't finish, but I did want to make things while I was here. And then I think I didn't understand how much the posters became an outlet for trying to put this time into some form. And treat it like it was a performance or an event or something very finite, like the way a poster kind of archives a live situation. So I think that really spiraled into something fun. Yeah.
If you were to design your perfect residency so that it's going to be scalable for others to kind of support artists in residency, what would it entail? Like length of time, financial support, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The real practical things that an artist needs and wants to kind of integrate into your practice.
That's a really good question too, because because I was meant to come for 2 months in the beginning, I did feel that pressure that you must have felt for 2 weeks, where it was almost, I had a really hard time settling, but that was because I knew I had to paint. And painting is very, for me anyway, it's long form. So when I found out that I could stay a bit longer, I relaxed. Like with every bit that I knew I could be there a bit more, I relaxed more. And so I think at different times in one's life, the longer the better, or the shorter the better. For example, being in Spoleto in that Italian residency, I was there for 6 weeks. And it was perfect because it wasn't really enough time to feel the pressure of having to make a body of work, but I did get to make enough that I had stored up a certain amount of potential to go back with. So I think asking the artist, grading it between 2 and 6 months to me seems realistic, because a short residency, for example, it would just be better to be a holiday. I wouldn't want to bring my things because then I would be tortured. But knowing that, calibrating like what you can do in a certain amount of time and knowing that in advance, I think is important for curtailing and structuring production, because one does want to work through, the procrastination, the boredom, the doubt, like those things do work better if you know it's finite. But I guess that what is useful for someone seems very specific. So I think the ideal residency is one where you can grade the amount of time you need, where it's not put on you. So you could say to someone, you can have between 2 and 6 months. And then that would really reflect upcoming projects, if it's a moment of downtime or of recalibrating, or if it's working towards something, in which case they're very different needs. So I really don't think the residency always can be determined from the outset if you plan for it or apply for it too far in advance, it may not work. And also definitely that you're allowed to bring someone with you, because it's not realistic after a certain point to leave partners or families and those sorts of things. So also times of year, depending on your family structure, it seems very important.
Do you think it's different for you in the kinds of ways that ideally a residency could be calibrated?
Yeah, I think what you were saying about flexibility is definitely important. And just, I don't know, I guess the residency is still sort of this elusive, like very privileged thing. And I think just reducing the number of barriers to access as much as possible, because it is something that you have to have time for, you have to disrupt your schedule. For me, I could do it because I was a master's student with a very flexible schedule, and but if I had a job, I probably couldn't do it. And so even for 2 weeks, I think just having kind of a diverse range of residencies that are funded, that are supported, that accommodate a range of levels. So I think for me, the fact that I'm not known, that I was given this opportunity as kind of an unknown person that was selected from an open call, I think that was really huge for me, and something that often isn't done, because to put trust into someone unknown is also difficult for maybe the person providing funding, the organization or institution. But I think it can be very rewarding for both parties. So I'd say just kind of having a diverse range of residency types and formats. And even, I don't know, I could even imagine like a 2-day residency being really productive for me, I don't know, or 6 months.
I mean, I also, when I was younger, I applied to many residencies and got rejected from all of them. So it was something I really wanted to do at a certain stage. When I graduated undergrad, I was like, I'm ready. And everyone was like, no. There was something about my practice. There was something about my application. I don't know, but it was, I gave up on the idea of residencies. I turned my life and my studio practice into trying to compensate for this lack of getting into residencies. And I knew some people who were obsessed and went from residency to residency, in all different ways. And I could see that there were going to have to be ways of giving myself whatever the residency was giving people, because I couldn't access it. And all the residencies that I've been on I haven't really applied. They've been circumstantial. Like the one in Tussauds-Lewitt came through, or to Priano, the Mahler-Lewitt Studios came because I was in a show with someone and she was organizing it. And I really gave up on residencies. After X amount of rejections, you think, okay, cool, I will figure something else out. So I also think that, even being rejected from something gives you an idea of what you need. And that can also be helpful.
Hi, thank you. I'm really terrible with names, so I apologise. You were talking a little bit earlier about how the residencies had enabled you to see the mechanics of an artistic process unfolding in front of you. Those weren't your words, but something to that effect. And I wondered if you could expand a little bit more about how the after effects of residencies for Hauser and Wirth. So what are how do these residencies change the institution, for want of a better word?
Is that for me?
I think so. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, I have a particular role in Hauser and Wirth, which is I'm a curator. And for me, I have done residencies, not often. There are fewer residencies for curators. But for me, having artists on residency within the gallery setting, within the kind of structure, the wider structure of Hauser and Wirth, is incredibly important, because it does allow the opportunity to engage with the artists, to have a dialogue with the artists, and it's really a kind of extension of the opportunity that a studio visit gives to a curator. And for me, those experiences, I think it's a very privileged experience that curators get to visit artists in their studios. And it is an incredible insight into the working practice of an artist. And so when Allison was here, I visited her. We began a kind of conversation, which I think is a kind of ongoing relationship, conversation, understanding of her work and the way that she works, the way that might have been transformed by coming down here to Somerset, shared kind of enthusiasms. I loved the fact that she got into book collecting. I thought that was amazing, and that they were totally fascinating, the books that she bought. And the way that she speaks about her work. So, these possibilities of proximity and engagement, I think, are really, really crucial. And the insights that they provide. And I find them incredibly stimulating. And I think it is somehow different when you encounter someone who is not in their usual context, but they've shifted their working practice to another context. And particularly quite a special one here in Somerset, which is, an extraordinary location. And I think part of the brilliance of having the gallery here is that it engages with a completely different context within Britain. So it's the accumulation of all of those things that I find incredible. One of the other residencies that I have done as a curator was in Chile. I got invited to spend some time in Chile, in Santiago. I asked if we could go to Valparaiso, and then we spent 3 days in the Atacama, and that was wild because it was such a different context. But I learned a huge amount about place and location and a completely different environment that I'd encountered before. So that I think shifting location, shifting context, and finding another place to work that challenges you, that maybe doesn't look like work that could be sitting outside, lying on rocks, going for a walk, could be about doubt and procrastination, I think is really generative as well. Sorry, that's ask a curator a question, you get a long answer.
Thank you, Tanya, and Leela, and Allison, and thank you so much for trusting us today to kind of explore that really vulnerable space in the studio. It is such a privilege. Thank you so much. All right, welcome back, everybody, to the afternoon session of Learning Exchange. It's my incredibly great pleasure to welcome Frances back here in Somerset. It's been an absolutely huge honor and joy for our entire team to work with you this year on this incredible exhibition of Phyllida's. Earlier you said to me that a curator is someone who doesn't know, it's not someone who knows everything, but it's someone who's curious to know more. And that really resonated with me this morning, and we have so much to learn from you. So thank you for being here with us today. And thank you for bringing this outstanding and highly moving representation of Phyllida's work to Somerset. And we look forward to hearing more about the exhibition, the selections you've made, and what you hope it tells us about Phyllida.
Thank you. Actually, it's an enormous pleasure for me to come back here today, because I had the most incredible experience working with Hauser Wirth as an organisation, but also in particular with the team here working on this show. And I can hear something. Is it the cricket? Yeah. Okay. I think for all of us, it was a very emotional journey. I met Phyllida maybe 14, 15 years ago, and I intersected with Phyllida in a number of public forums, mostly talking about art. Firstly, we talked a lot about Louise Bourgeois, who was one of her great the great figures that she, also her work kind of was configured around in response to, reaction to, with affection and also a degree of antagonism. And then later I also talked with Phyllida about her own work, and was very fortunate enough to be invited by the Fruit Market and Phyllida to contribute to the catalogue, or write the catalogue for Phyllida's work for the Fruit Market, which enabled me to have the luxury of about 15 studio visits and about 40 hours of recorded interviews. And I remember that just after Phyllida's death, which came completely out of the blue, and I had been thinking prior to that, I decided already to step down from Tate. And one of the, you always hold these enticements ahead of you when anything traumatic is heading. And I thought, at least I'll be able to work with Phyllida again. Anyway, so I was going through that journey when I heard that Phyllida had died. And I had a weekend on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall, completely off-grid. And I took all the transcripts from all the interviews that I had done with her and read them all. And I have to say it was the most astonishing, revelatory and very moving experience, because all of you who have ever met Phyllida, I know lots of you have, and who have worked with her, she was the most astonishing conversationalist, brilliant, energetic, compassionate. Every now and again she'd say, "Frances, shall we stop? You look tired. Are you hungry? Can I make you a sandwich?" But revelation after revelations. And I think when, I think it was Ivan approached me and asked me whether I would take on the challenge of curating the show here in Bruton that Phyllida had already agreed to do, a 10th anniversary show for the gallery, 10th anniversary show for her relationship with this place. It was knowledge that there was still this enormous area to investigate and so much more to learn, and a little bit that you could take the conversation further almost without the artist. That meant that I had absolutely no hesitation in saying, yes, I'd love to do the show. But I've had a long curatorial career, and I've always worked with very dead artists, so dead that you're not even really dealing with their nearest and dearests. You may be dealing with their very difficult estates or daughters and sons and nephews and nieces, but that gives you a degree of freedom. I mean, Giacometti, wonderful. He doesn't haunt me. The work is, you can do what you like with it. And then, of course, a living artist. And when you work with a living artist, there's another kind of joy and sometimes a kind of horror that comes from, having that relationship when you're in a very vulnerable position. But to be asked to be the sort of, kind of pivoting the artist from their full-on, completely, I'm alive and I've had this amazing forward momentum, which Phyllida had. There's no late work with Phyllida. She died almost mid-sentence in terms of her career. To have to transition an artist or help be the person that has to transition the living into a kind of living dead. Because, of course, what we all want with the artists that we love is for their work to go on, to have a legacy, to still be part of the world, to be, the work is still alive, the work is never dead. And in a way, that was the principal challenge that I think we all felt, the team here, myself, Phyllida's extensive family, that there was a really important job to be done, which was not to put the kind of lid on the coffin, but to, in a way, open a door onto the life of the work that would continue and to begin to kind of find new meanings, a kind of reckoning. And so reading through all the conversations and looking at the work and thinking about the last few years of her practice and visiting in my imagination and through the amazing images that the team here commissioned of her studios, because of course one couldn't, as soon as an estate goes into lockdown after somebody is dead, there was a question of how do we construct something in these galleries here for an audience who, for many of whom, it might be the first time they've ever heard of this artist's work, but then there'd also be a considerable audience who was very familiar with her work. And then, of course, the really important audience, all the people, well, all audiences are important, though Phyllida would challenge me on that, I know. She didn't have a huge amount of respect for audiences in terms of her work. All the people who had bought into Phyllida, her family, her colleagues, all the art historians and curators, and I know there was a lot of expectation around making this exhibition from all those people. So it was a kind of perfect project, but one freighted with difficulties and challenges. And So how did I approach it? Well, I think Phyllida appeared, from the this is very irritating, the footing. And it's not football. I mean, it's not cricket, it is football. No, it's rugby. Okay. Even worse. Phyllida would have said, stop. I will try and focus on this space, not that space. I think I thought very carefully about it. Before I even thought about which works to put in the show, what were her kind of the principles, the passions, the things that motivated her in making work and making exhibitions? And I think if I can be very sort of, maybe it's a bit dualistic, but she was absolutely an artist rooted in the history of art. Both, she was of a generation that she went to art school when modernism was still the great project. And she was taught sculpture and painting to begin with in a sort of skill-based framework, very old-fashioned, but actually arguably an amazing way to teach. She was given the tools to make her art, and the tools included not just actually understanding how to work with clay or how to work with canvas and the various materials and the toolkit, but also she was taught and understood the history of art from which her own generation, in which her own generation situated itself. And she was enormously interested and adept, and any of you who've ever talked to her or heard her writing, her references were extraordinary. So she was very much in that world of art, but she was also brilliantly an artist who was very much in the world. And, when you read or talk to her about her very early experiences, yes, of course, it was leafing through the book on Cézanne that her parents had on the shelves, but it was also, at least as powerfully, the experience of being driven round the East End of London in the aftermath of the Second World War and seeing these monochrome bomb sites with houses destroyed, and in their absence, like sort of tooth pulled out, the residue of former domestic spaces hanging off the walls of adjacent buildings, so staircases and mantelpieces and shelving hanging off the walls, and those grey landscapes being interrupted by the incredibly vivid colours of buddleia growing. And I think she always, throughout her life, there was a dialogue between the desire to really think about form, materiality, and questions very germane to an artist's studio practice. And not just taking them on, but eviscerating them, turning them inside out and back to front and challenging all those rules. But also this desire to reflect the world in which she lived, and in particular the sense, I think, of the absurd. As a child of the Second World War, and then experiencing the madness of the 1960s into the chaos of the 1960s, the 70s, and the endless interplay between war, the threat of war, climate emergency, oil crisis. There's this endless to and fro between those positions, and she was always or often in conversation really embarrassed about what she said, I don't have a subject, but of course she had a huge subject. It wasn't articulated in the way many artists articulate their subject, but their passion and engagement with the world, and for doing it through materials and their destruction and their manipulation, of course, was her forte. And so the kind of conceptualizing the exhibition was to bring those two things together. I was very conscious that in the time I had known Phyllida, she was like a concertina artist. She'd been playing in one register, a teacher, unknown, in the studio, making her own opportunities, incredibly entrepreneurial, but often without an audience, taking work out on the street, using the front room of a neighbour's house. She went from that pretty quickly to this national acclaim and really an international kind of stardom. You know, she became very, very widely known for these amazing, space invasive, space hungry, kind of apocalyptic, storm-bound, material dense installations. And over the last few years before her death, as she became older and as she became more conscious of the personal and human impact or planetary impact of those big projects, you know, shipping great works and materials around the world in containers or aeroplanes and teams of people, and the kind of the things that come with that process, you know, the big studio, all taking away from the sense of intimacy, immediacy, softness of touch, spontaneity of her earlier work, was causing an reappraisal in her work. And those of you who will have seen the Royal Academy exhibition, for example, and thinking about that, comparing it to her great project in 2017 in the Venice Biennial, or prior to that, Doc at Tate Britain, which I think was one of her most astonishing accomplishments, can begin to see that she was beginning to move away from these massive space invading, sort of performative projects to refocusing in on sculpture as a 360 thing that you walk around and that relates to its own history. And so very early on in conceptualizing the show, I decided that was the sort of, they were the parameters. I wanted to do something that would relocate her in the history of sculpture as an artist who actually, in a way, was sometimes quite a traditional sculptor, that she could make objects in their own space, if not on plinths, then, you know, located permanently with references to the history of art. But I also wanted to create a sense that the big installation, the way the work could invade the space and take on the kind of theatricality of a performance in a temporary environment of the exhibition, that did not die with her. And so they were two ambitions. And alongside that, I wanted to make sure that her loss was in some weird way our gain. I know that sounds sort of like a terrible thing to say, but once they've taken a back seat in terms of their own control, all sorts of things happen. So one ambition for the show that I think all her family and her assistants felt was that to bring the studio into the exhibition space was incredibly important. When Phyllida was working on the project for Folly in Venice, I think she wrote very eloquently. She kept a diary, and she was very nervous about the project, because I think it was a moment where she was beginning to understand that there was a difference between making big projects with teams of assistants and registrars and curators and art handlers, and actually the business of making a sculpture in the studio all on your own, that sense of your space, that intimacy. And she was feeling the loss of that in these big projects. But she wrote very eloquently about the journey from the studio to the gallery, and that, you know, you can complete a work of art in the studio and it feels complete, but it gets into the gallery and it has a life of its own. And it'll engage with, you know, the space, the time, the temperature, the people, the other works. And that was our challenge here. How do you take the studio, particularly without the alchemy of the artists themselves, and bring it into the gallery and let it live and breathe? And the fact that I think we did that in certain parts of the show anyway, really is a tribute to the generosity with which Phyllida's partner Fabian, her husband, and her kids just said, go with it. You know, you have license to take a few risks, to kind of do Phyllida-like risks, and the team here, that we probably pushed these galleries to the limits of what was possible, and certainly pushed the technicians I think on sort of day 19, when, you know, I said to Ellie, it's not working, you know, can we reconfigure this? That they very dutifully took a deep breath and said, yes. Anyway, we pushed and pulled in the way that I think Phyllida would push and pull until we felt that we had a kind of tipping point where it all worked. But I thought some of you, I'm sure, have seen the show, hopefully a number of times, but I thought I could just talk you through a few images of the show to give you some sort of sense of that. I'm going to show you, this is the first work that you see when you come into the first gallery. And for an artist whose career dates right back to the 1960s, it's not a very early work, it's from 1994. And of course, the first thing really to be said about Phylida's career is that the first almost 30 years of her active history as a maker, there's nothing left apart from a sequence of black and white and colour photographs. And it's such a tragedy because her early story, for me as an art historian, is completely fascinating. Because you can read through her emerging understanding and response to the history of sculpture. And her work begins with an engagement in surrealist biomorphism and takes on then is a response to post-war European sculpture, but you know the Richiers and the Giacomettis, and she moves through that to encountering minimalism and post-minimalism at the same time, and then arte pauvre, and all of those things come through her work, and she acknowledges them all with absolute honesty and generosity, and nothing in her work is a parody. Well, maybe parody is the right word. Nothing is a copy. But the influences are absorbed and spewed out and churned over and brilliantly pleasant. But the work that remains is really from the 90s onwards. And so, but the work that remains, as always, references much earlier work from the history of art. And so I wanted in this very first gallery, you begin with this Object for Television, one of the series of works she made during a period where she had very few public exhibitions, so she made work to exhibit in her own way, in the front room of a neighbour's house or a friend's living room or on the street, so that she could pit her work into a public space, take it out of the studio and reflect upon it. And this is the one remaining object, these wonderful bunny ears. And I hope as you walk past, you see everywhere the bunny ears. We think of artists' careers as linear, but most careers are circular, or they're like an infinity loop. You know, Louise Bourgeois, I do, I undo, I redo. And Phyllida talked a lot about making and unmaking, that art being a process of construction and destruction, and all her work loops back, incorporates, and to move on. So this first gallery, each work is what I would call a singular sculpture. And all of these works come out of a studio practice, which is almost 7 decades long, and continues through those the more recent decades of these massive installations, where it seems as if Phyllida's whole life is devoted to responding to big spaces and building in them. But actually, she went back to her studio and she worked in a very solitary and thoughtful way on projects that continue that sort of secret conversation. And I'm sure this is an area of her work that we will see really thought through and written about in coming years and decades. So this is a selection of those wonderful works. And you can quote, you know, anybody who knows a little bit about the history of art and post-war era can say, goodness me, that looks like, you know, jarred combined with pistoletto, you know, the hard and the soft, bringing impossible things together. The piece behind me has references to Cholida in it, for example, and I first saw the wonderful, in fact, her first posthumous exhibition, because she had just died before it was installed, Cholida Lecco. And we were talking about Boerty earlier this morning. Who was talking about Boerty? You were talking about Boerty, these beautiful felt columns which Phyllida made from soft materials stacked up to make a solid material, and referenced the series of beautiful columns that Alighieri Boetti made out of doilies in, I think, the 1970s. But what was great about Phyllida is that she was always incredibly articulate and open and honest about the references. So the quotations are, you know, are footnoted in her own writings about artists. And I know you asked me to talk a little bit about Phyllida as a teacher, and I probably won't get to that because we're still on room 1 and I've almost run out of time. She learnt from everybody. She absolutely absorbed, you know, she learnt from her students. She gave to her students, so that everything was reciprocal, a giving back and a taking forward. And I think that's one of the absolutely respect for other people's practice. And I have never met an artist who was so generous or articulate in the way they acknowledged their peers, their followers, their predecessors, and her work, which was just always so visually literate and articulate. A wonderful piece again that I always think of Schritter's when I think of this piece of the kind of strange oddball object, but made out of a sculpture made out of a series of paintings. And the other thing that right at the beginning we have in this gallery at the far is the beginnings of that dialogue that you can see throughout her career between painting and sculpture. It is actually silly only to have half an hour, isn't it, to talk about Phyllida? Read the book, it's coming out soon. But so this gallery is all about art, and these are all internally, they're kind of homages to other artists and works that take her studio practice forward. The next little gallery we rupture straight away, you can just see it here, by this wonderful series of drawings of upside-down houses that Phyllida made from the first decade of this century onwards, and that really speak to her love of kind of disaster porn. I mean, she was fascinated by the kind of epic scale of global disasters, whether they were pandemics or wildfires or wars, and had this horrible delight in, you know, I mean, Gaza would have kept her rapturously in front of the television. She was passionately, disturbed and captivated by these stories of planetary and the destruction of people, and the surveillance camera absolutely engaged with the modern world. And I think her larger installations all speak to that agenda of how do we comprehend the absurdity of the lives that we lead at this moment in time. She was an artist that, as a younger person, was brought up in a family still living in the 1950s. Her parents, particularly her mother, were absolutely make do and get by. You know, her mother would keep every little bit of waste paper, every yogurt pot, every bit of cardboard, and the Christmas decorations were painted cardboard. They'd made doll's house furniture out of walnuts and cocktail sticks. And I think Phyllida was brought up in that mould of treasuring and using waste, of not discarding anything. And she was horrified by the kind of the consumerism of our age, and much of the work speaks to that kind of recycling, the dealing with the mess, both the kind of love of it and a disdain for it. So this is the second gallery, is the gallery where we really tried, above all, to create an environment that would take Phyllida's sense of how she used space and materials, and creating these very theatrical scenarios, theatrical but for you, the person, you are the person who animates as you walk through it. And we did that by selecting work that we felt was the kind of work that she had brought together in previous projects. And many of the pieces in this gallery are work pieces that featured in Folly or in her new museum show, and a number of other shows where she did these sort of interventions. But apart from the objects themselves, many of which she called props rather than sculptures, because they were designed to be brought together in scenarios rather than images that you would see on and walk around 360 degrees. And what I tried to do was work with Barlow's own strategies for installation. Like she had a preference for blocking entrances, for bringing people up short, asking them to wait, so they experience the sort of anxiety or the moment, the threshold. She then created pathways through her spaces that took people on a journey that wasn't the expected way. She blocked the way. You could not walk across her galleries. You had to go round and underneath something. You had to, works helped you experience gravity, helped you experience the claustrophobia of enclosure. And I think she spoke very eloquently when she was in Venice, and she was sandwiched between two pavilions which were moving image and performance. And I think momentarily she felt a little bit like, I'm such an old lady, I still make sculpture. But of course she made sculpture that the audience becomes the performer in. And the moving image is the moving image in the eye. And much of that understanding of space and installation, I think, comes from her early interest in cinema. And we haven't got time to talk about that, but cinema and animation were incredibly important in her early career, thinking about how you populate space with objects and how you choreograph the movement of audiences around them. But this was the high-risk scenario in the exhibition. But so much of what she's left behind are these great elements from kind of performative installations. And it seemed a very important venture for Hauser to find a way of doing that with honesty and a sense of sort of creating an environment that respected Phyllida's own, the rules of the game that she set out. Just one of the things that the grey palette that so many of those prop sculptures have is always intercut. And if you look at catalogues of Phyllida's installations, you'll see this predominant grey in the late work, but then always shot through by these brilliant works in colour, and her colour palette of pink and red and green and blue was absolutely magical. And it was a colour palette that referred to the street. When you think about street furniture and builders and buses, the red of the London bus and the old-fashioned telephone booth, very much colours, the colours of the Budlier in the post-war, the colours that are terribly important to Phyllida to animate these grey scenarios. And again, looking at these pieces on the wall, these billboards, these toilette signs, or toilet, as I used to think of them as a child who couldn't spell, are also paintings. And Phyllida, who had to give up painting at art school because she simply was not good enough in her first year, always remained a painter. And painting, when we begin to think about her sculpture, is everywhere. It's a way of decorating the surface, it's a way of animating, it's a way of giving symbolically finishing a piece of work. And there's a long history and a long future for us to think about the relationship between painting and sculpture in Phyllida's work, and indeed, in fact, in the history of sculpture since the Second World War. Then, of course, they're the studio practice of the big sculptures, the theatrical scenarios of the major commissions, and then the insight into her studio. And I think what was important to me was for an artist who lived the last years of her life so publicly, was to actually demonstrate how much of her work depended on, long time on her own in the studio. And there's a wonderful film for those of you who've seen the exhibition, which was made for a Royal Academy film, where she's working on a small scale kind of lumpy sculpture in the studio, and it's obviously getting nowhere, and she picks it up and she just throws it on the floor. And I think her studio was really a place where she could break all the rules and she could do it privately, and it was a space that she adored. And so these are a number of the maquettes that she was working on or worked on over the last 10 years for major projects. But on the back wall there you see a very small selection of the extraordinary handmade pieces that she made during lockdown. And they hark back to handmade pieces that she made throughout her career, sometimes with her eyes closed, which was all about the tactility of the materials and the hand, the material, and the brain working in a kind of autonomous cycle. And she'd pick up rubbish from the bin and dip it in a pot of plaster and dribble it all down her clothes. But it was all about feeling your way into a work and then breaking it and reforming it. And I think these works are almost Phyllida in her element. I mean, they're fantastic. And very poignantly, maquettes are works that she never came to realise. And you see in these small works the germination of many of the larger works. And you see throughout them a kind of conversation between much earlier work and future work. This was her studio practice, where it was a sort of, sort of generator of everything else that she did. We were very fortunate to be able to show these 3 very small sculptures that again refer to an earlier practice in the years when she had very few projects and she had to rely on her own self to create her own projects. Enormously willful as an artist and enormously disciplined. So without a deadline, without a project, she would set herself her own tasks. So these are from a series of sort of projects that she made in the studio where she just took a material and would do one repetitive thing with it. These are bindings using materials like, cellophane, for example, and sellotape. Incredibly, all investigatory. And it's interesting talking about studio practice this morning and talking about the hours of procrastination, the doubt, the doing nothing. I don't think Phyllida ever did nothing in her studio. She was always messing. Her hands were never still. Everything was an experiment. But maybe that was her own way of dealing with her demons. She would, she did not sleep. And then a very little series of canvases. When I heard that, when I was asked to do the show, I had no idea where Phyllida had got to in her journey. I hoped it was moving forward, but I was reliably then informed that it was. I had a conversation with her studio assistant, Lucy, who told me that Phyllida, after all these reflections on the kind of the carbon emissions of the big shows, the challenges of shipping work, the complexities of working with a studio, the cost of storage, real crises in her approach. She had decided that going forward as a senior figure, as she was getting older, she would move into her new adventure would be real painting, not just the engaging painting in relation to sculpture, with all the drama of that, but she was finally going to do in a way, the unthinkable, because she had always railed against the pictorial. 2 dimensions, 1 dimension, not enough. There's lots and lots of writing about the limitations of the painting, the limitations of looking from a fixed difference, even from the oblique. But finally, not so long before she died, she had decided that she would begin to reduce her practice and begin to explore painting as a medium that she could do on her own, without support, without necessarily exhibitions, and it would be a kind of a new adventure. And she had agreed to make the show here for the 10th anniversary, and she hadn't really begun to think about what was going to be in it, except that she was going to have one big room of big paintings. We will never know what those paintings would have been like, but the very first step, apart from the decision to making them, was to make this tiny sequence of tiny paintings. And we decided to call them maquette paintings, because I don't think they're studies. I think they were just like how do I do this? Experimental, beginning to think, really painting on real canvas for the first time. Of course, she'd had a career of painting drawings, but she always talked about them differently. And so this little installation in this tiny little pigsty room is in a way the promise of the future that never happened. But of course, there are paintings absolutely engaged, completely in the history of sculpture and in her own work. So she was using painting, at least in these maquettes, as a kind of commentary on her work and possibly seeding new ideas for the future. Who knows? She didn't talk about them, but I think I wanted to include them just to make the point that here was an artist for whom there is no late work. If we talk about her late work, it's a kind of curatorial imposition on a career that was going absolutely full strong and was going in new directions. As at any point when you look back in Phyllida's trajectory, it was a continuously moving landscape as the work developed and moved on. She was a completely restless artist, and she used that word restless for sculpture, but actually the restlessness was in her, and you see it in the sculpture, that there's never any moment that a sculpture can be said to somehow make a conclusion or be a chapter end. And then this room was just an indulgence, really. I loved the way that Phyllida, she talked about phallocentrism, but there's a lot of testicular work in her. You know, she took on the male establishment, and these great balls that are absolutely slashed seem to speak volumes about her whole approach to life. And interestingly, she often talked about the lump and what you do with it, the lump of clay. How do you deal with it? These are lumps, and they're great when you look at them and go up close to them. They're made out of the nastiest, the most horrible, the cheapest of fabrics from the high street. Really, really nasty bits of material, and they're covered in plaster and cement and every nasty thing you could possibly do, and they're completely beautiful. And that paradox of seeing great beauty in ugliness and great joy in tragedy is something that seems to me so fundamental to Phyllida's art. And when you look at these pieces and they register in your head and you begin to flick through books of Phyllida's work, you realise that actually, although she's an artist, the work keeps moving. She's also an artist where she doubles up. She goes, as I said before, I undo, and redo. And this doubling, the doppelganger, and the lump, and the ball, and the testicle, and the materials, and the blood, and the guts. These are eviscerated. And the only person who would ever really talk about these brilliantly was Phyllida Barlow. So everything for me about Phyllida somehow is in this room. And to put these in this beautiful little sort of farmyardy space just seemed perfect, because they're totally inappropriate, and yet they can look amazing. And several people said to me, "How did you get them in?" And of course, I was too tired at the opening to remember, but I think we took them all away. And only Phyllida would get Hauser to take them all away. And then, of course, the drawings are beautiful, and I love doing this. We took as the team here, we took a few risks with Phyllida, and we had a very, very clear layout for most of the rooms, apart from this room. And there was a point when we were laying this out that I said to Ellie, "We need more small drawings." And I mean, you ask Tate that, they say, "Sorry, you need 6 months to get a loan in." I think you said 24 hours, and there were enough small drawings to fill the gaps in this salon hang. And what was wonderful in working, yes, you said this, you said it, when you work with the work, you learn with the work. And I know more about Phyllida, or differently about Phyllida now, than I did beforehand. And what I loved was just going through the drawings. It's just, you see the centrality of the bunny ears. And but you see on the pink drawing there, the bunny ears there, and the sculpture everywhere. And nowhere in any interview with anybody ever, including all the interviews I did anybody ask Phyllida where the bunny ears came from? Which is in a way a tragedy, but we can speculate till the end of mankind. And then, of course, the outside. Phyllida was would use any surface and any height. And so I remember coming down here to see the galleries for the first time, and Neil Wenman, the senior director at Hauser, he said, "Put them anywhere, spill them, throw them." And I thought, I'll remember that. So we did a bit of that. We spilled. And this was a work that was installed in Phyllida's first exhibition here in 2014 and was, I thought, rather staidly stacked up in the little sort of pigsty outbuilding. What's it called, that space? The piggery. And so we thought that this would be something like quite nice to do something that actually Phyllida hadn't done with it, but we thought would probably have been in the spirit of Phyllida's picking up the lump and throwing it on the floor. And the technicians, who are normally charged with being incredibly careful with the work, were a little bit, have we really got to throw these on the floor? But I think it just looks, and this is in a way the tribute to Phyllida, and I think the fact that the family and the gallery agreed that we could do this with such a precious work of art was a mark of respect for Phyllida and her legacy. And then the biggest gift of all, of course, with this was Phyllida's really last work, which was the work that she'd made for the public gardens in Lower Manhattan, a set of 7 sculptures. And this is the second edition of those works, that it was agreed that we could install them across the site. And for me, they squared the circle in the absence of Phyllida's very early work, which often brought these strange sort of biomorphic forms that are a bit cartoony, but in terms of the history of art, speak to Phyllida's first love, her love of art and Miro and biomorphism. And she was a huge fan of surrealism, Phyllida. She loved the disparity of bringing weird things together. She loved the sort of sensualism and the kind of eroticism of biomorphic form. But in her own early work, she often married those very organic, sexy, bodily forms, very slippery, rubbery things, with very linear, rectangular, linear, formal, minimalist work. And it's always been that bringing together of incompatible things, which is itself is very surrealist, was at the core of her work. So she was able to marry minimalism and surrealism. So, you know, somewhere Donald Judd is turning in his grave, as is Sol LeWitt. But here is Phyllida in her almost 80s, still rocking the boat of art history and saying, you've got to take down these borders. And, you know, there's so much power in bringing the incompatible together. So I was completely thrilled when these works were, you know, when it was agreed that we could have them here, and putting them in this gorgeous, beautiful garden and bringing that sense of absurdity and hilarity and actually kind of joy with being alive and the role of art in our lives felt like sort of icing on the cake. And I have to say, our Hauser Wirth is a very nice cake. And so we enjoyed putting the icing on. Anyway, I've spoken far too long. I could go on, but that's it, I think.
I will keep this very short and brief. A very warm welcome to Jane Sills, master of many things, which I'll let you guys discuss, and Alan Kirwan, Hauser Wirth's learning manager. We look forward to hearing more about your work supporting artists, educators, and ensuring good quality learning is accessible to all. Over to Alan.
Thank you, Leah. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a kind of where Jane and I are wrapping up the day, basically, and it's really a pleasure to have Jane here. Engage, many of you will know, some may not know. They're like a scaffolding in terms of museum and gallery education and learning for many educators who are involved in the sector. And I thought maybe just for our session, what we would talk about, just to give you a sense of the context, maybe at the beginning of our talk, it might be quite nice for maybe those who mightn't be as familiar with the work of Engage to delve into that history. It's a 35-year history, a very rich and deep history of the association. And maybe to start with that, and then we expanded a little bit more in a wider sense around learning as a concept for, I suppose, that gallery educator profile and role. So thank you, Jane. And I suppose in my mind, I thought immediately to kick off would be, considering the history, what would have been the sources of inspiration that started Engage? What was the reason for its foundation? And maybe how has the mission evolved over the decades? What's changed?
So I'm going to refer back to quite a lot of what was touched on this morning and some of the amazing conversations that I've been able to have with the amazing colleagues who are here, who are artists and teachers and people working with an engagement and participation, and talk a little bit about how the National Association for Gallery Education, bit of a mouthful, was formed, and really what the antecedents of all that was. And I know there are people here who were involved in that and are researching it at the moment, which is really exciting. So Engage came about, as Alan said, 35 years ago. I'm a founder member. At that time, I was working at Icon Gallery in Birmingham. And during that period, I've been really involved with Engage. So I've been a member and an area rep in the West Midlands. I was a vice chair for a while, and I've worked for Engage for a couple of decades now as its director. So Engage came about in a really surprising way. The then Arts Council of Great Britain invited a group of colleagues, including myself, who were involved in gallery education very early in our careers, to form a network. I think that initiative came about because the Arts Council could see the proliferation of really extraordinary work happening throughout the United Kingdom, which had really begun to develop since the late 1970s and was flourishing by the mid-1980s. And that was often supported by the Arts Council, but then also by the regional arts boards. And I think what is, for me, was so exciting about that work that I was so lucky to be involved in. It was very much about artists working with audiences and arts organisations being part of that partnership with schools and people working with community groups. And there was amazing practice happening throughout the United Kingdom. There are colleagues here, which is lovely for me, from Arnolfini in Bristol, where the most extraordinary work was happening. There was equally brilliant work happening in Birmingham and Colchester in Birmingham, Manchester, across the northwest, in London, but also in Edinburgh. You mentioned Fruit Market Gallery in North Wales, really all over the United Kingdom, an incredibly exciting period. So there was a very important meeting which took place in 1988 in Southampton. Fran, who's a colleague here, who's writing her a PhD around some of this early history of gallery education, and I were laughing about how everyone has a different version of the history of Engage, which is probably typical of an organisation where the group of people all know their own minds, I suppose. But at this meeting that I was at, so I'm sure I'm right, what was really interesting is we came together to discuss creating a network to support gallery education. And there were colleagues there from across Wales and England. Now, what I think is really fascinating about that meeting is there were lots of teachers there, and there were many, many arts advisors as well. And there were probably a smaller number of gallery educators and curators. But the network that was formed was very much of gallery educators, but really importantly of curators too, who were really passionate about this area of emerging practice and real pioneers as well. And I think I always found it really interesting. It was that group of people who decided they wanted to come together and form an association. So at that early time, the mission of Engage, which is still within our Articles of Association, was very much about supporting gallery education practice. And it's quite specific in our articles. It says through workshops and activities, which I think takes it back to the idea of practice and artist practice, and that being a way to understand contemporary visual arts in some way. And then, sorry, I have more.
You have more? No, because I was just going to jump in on something.
Oh, no, you jump in.
You mentioned Birmingham, Manchester. The Northwest seemed particularly important from what you said there. I'm just wondering why? What was happening particularly in that part of the country?
I mean, I think for me, as somebody young and working in this area of practice, there were some really important practitioners. So Jenny Lomax, working at the Whitechapel with that amazing team at the Whitechapel in London, but then there was slightly later actually the extraordinary Sue Clive, who has worked at Corner House that then became Home, and there were also, I think, really close connections for me between artist practice which emerged from working with communities oftentimes, as well as really exciting work happening in schools, and then what emerged with colleagues working in organisations which in some instances were being set up. So Corner House was set up, I think, in the 80s.
Yeah, in the 80s.
Yeah. And so just a little more in terms of how Engage has evolved. So I keep calling it Engage. In fact, during the 1990s, National Association of Gallery Education was still called that. And then my predecessor, Christopher Naylor, a man of enormous energy, renamed the organisation Engage. And the work began to really develop across Scotland and Wales. He forged some really exciting partnerships with government, developed some strategic work, which I'll talk about later, and made some really important international connections, particularly with Europe. But I think that mirrors very much the way the visual arts operate. There's always that curiosity, isn't there, to explore those international as well as the countrywide boundaries. And I suppose something that's really interested me is how the fortunes of Engage and of this area of practice have really, over the last 35 years, waxed and waned, almost in parallel with what's happening in the world, because I suppose it's so intimately connected with politics and the development of teaching of art and design, and of some of the things you talked about already about the climate emergency, for example. So I suppose some of the kind of big things that I've noticed and shifts I've noticed have been, for example, with New Labour from the late 1990s, there was a massive injection of resource into the cultural sector, very much around making the arts accessible to underserved communities and actually beginning to pull together evidence about the impact of engagement in the arts. Then almost in contradiction to that, a very conservative period under the Coalition and Conservative administrations for a decade, where there was a focus around academic achievement and the status of art and design education really became much less valued within the state education in England. And now I suppose we're going into, I hope, a much more optimistic period with the new government who have already launched a great raft of initiatives about curriculum reform, creativity, improving the condition for teachers, and I think really importantly a delegated responsibility for culture at a local level, which feels so important. And I suppose for me, working for an organisation which works right across the United Kingdom and beyond, that interest and appetite for curriculum reform follows on from some really trailblazing work which has happened in Scotland and Wales, where the curriculum genuinely privileges creativity, which I think is so important.
Yeah, it's far ahead. It's on that point, really, creativity and innovation. It just, obviously with a history like that and kind of, you can see that seeping back into the early 70s and how it developed. It's clear that there's going to be a lot of innovative practice and a lot of different projects. And I suppose it might be interesting for people to know, from your perspective, were there one or two, well, there'd be many, but kind of key areas, which we've kind of talked about before, but kind of key projects that had deep impact or were significant from your point of view for Engage, that really made a difference?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a couple, and one, they're both actually, now I think about them, they sound quite dry, but I think they're really important strategically. But they're going to sound a little bit dry. So I was talking about the very innovative policies that the Labour administration from the late 1990s had in their approach to really opening up access to culture. there was an amazing initiative called the Strategic Commissioning Programme for Museum and Gallery Education, another mouthful, which ran from 2004 to 2011. And Engage was involved in the delivery of a visual arts element of that programme. Actually, Tate was also involved in the delivery of much of this initiative. And it really grew out of that concern that the government had about children and young people having access to the arts in a much more equitable way, which felt really important. So we delivered two programs. One was called Inquire, which is about research, and another one was called Watch Your Space, and that was very much about supporting artists and teachers. So with Inquire, the intention was to draw together evidence about the impact for children and young people of engaging with the visual arts and to build up an evidence base. And so there were partnerships, clusters of schools, artists, visual arts organisations and researchers who worked together. They used an inquiry-based method to explore a programme. Continued professional development ran across the programme, and that was all around capacity building. And I think what's really important about those inquiries was that everyone was an equal partner, so the teacher, the young people who were taking part, the artists, the arts organisations, and the researchers. There were no hierarchies. And with that evidence that we were able to gather over what was actually in the end quite a long period of time, we were able to publish and share that. And I think some of the most important ways that we were able, as an organisation, Engage, we were able to share that was with the HMIs for art and design, but also with funders and politicians, with colleagues in England, but also across the United Kingdom and internationally. And I think it was building that body of evidence which was really important. And then the other programme that we ran, which I just mentioned earlier, Watch This Space, was supporting schools new to working with galleries and artists new to working with schools. So the programme gave children and young people in schools who hadn't engaged with the arts the opportunity to have that experience, to come to places like this. And it really also supported teachers and artists to become more confident and skilled and to work together. I think that's what was so important. Again, we were able to share that practice through that quite long-lived programme with colleagues working in art and design, and it became an important, it was most importantly for us mentioned in an HMI report on the state of art and design education in 2011. So I think that's what we really wanted. We wanted to be able to shine a light on this kind of work, and it would be much more commonly understood and valued. So that's an example of something which was very well funded, had a lot of governmental support. The other example I have is actually in a way coming more from a position probably of anger and frustration, but was also quite strategic. So Generation Art was a touring exhibition of children and young people's artwork which toured to venues in Margate, Leicester and the Isle of Wight from 2016 to 2017. It came about as a consequence of a conversation I had with a group of colleagues who were working on the current art and design curriculum. So we were doing some work with the government. We didn't really feel our voices were being heard. We felt that the curriculum which was being created was very conservative. And I was asking both the HMI, Ian Middleton, who was working on that programme, but also our lead from the Subject Association, the National Society for Education and Art and Design, what we could do. And they said, which really surprised me, they said they organised an exhibition of children and young people's artwork just to demonstrate to teachers and parents and to young people themselves that being an artist is a really, really important way of being, and there are plenty of amazing creative opportunities in the world, and it's really, really worth persisting with art and design, and it is possible to train or pursue an education or work in this amazing sector. So that I then set about securing the funding and creating a project. But what I'm most proud of is that at those exhibitions at Turner Contemporary and amazing venues in Leicester and on the Isle of Wight, we had groups of young people who programmed the exhibitions, hung the shows, evaluated what was happening, and then actually, most importantly, went and talked about the experience at events all over the UK, but internationally. So I got to go with them, which was rather nice. So I got to go to Vienna and to Edinburgh, but they were speaking. I was simply the chaperone, and I think that was lovely. That felt... So that was going from a situation feeling really frustrated to thinking, what can we do which will be good about this?
Well, I saw some of the videos on the back of that work, and the one thing really struck out with me. There was a 17-year-old boy, and he, on the back of, I think it was at the Turner Contemporary part of the exhibition, and he just said it was the fact of my work was acknowledged that I could be creative, which I think for a lot of young people, they just want that acknowledgement, or want that sense in a school system that maybe doesn't allow that freedom of creativity. So I think just on a personal, the soft skills level was amazing, what came out of these projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Yeah, and it was lovely at Turner Contemporary because the Grayson Perry had just been installed, and then Generation Art was put up in that beautiful learning space that they have at Turner Contemporary. Yeah. And so it was the same group of technicians doing both shows.
Yeah. Actually, on that point, because clearly what you're talking about there is you went to different galleries, Turner Contemporary, you went to Leicester. Collaboration has always been a thing that Engage is renowned for. And I suppose the bigger question I would have about that then is, how has Engage used this idea of collaboration in arts education to its benefit, but the wider benefit of that sector of arts education?
Yeah, so in thinking about this question, I sort of thought about something a bit different in terms of partnership. And it's what I was pondering about was how partnership can be a really powerful tool in terms of driving systemic change. And so I think that during the 2 decades I've worked with Engage, some of the most important partnerships we've been involved in have been where we've noticed that there's something that perhaps needs to shift within the sector, and then wanted to work with others to enable that. So one example of that has been thinking about the inequality in terms of the visual arts workforce in the United Kingdom. And in particular, we've been involved in some really exciting work which has been particularly around raising the profile of disabled artists and access to disabled audiences to the visual arts. So there was an early programme that Engage developed with arts disability organisation SHAPE called Explore, where we work with visual artists and also with venues in Wales and England. And I think, interestingly, the evaluation from that, which Frances Morris worked on us with, quite spontaneously inspired colleagues in Scotland, Engage Scotland, but also Curator Scotland to initiate another programme called Everyone, which was about disabled artists and young people having much more access to the arts. And that much more recently stimulated a programme which is still going on called Not Going Back to Normal, which was led by the Collective Gallery in Edinburgh, where Creative Scotland and the collective really wanted to look at how the role and place of disabled artists in the Scottish visual arts community could be enhanced very much on those practitioners' own terms. And we're now working with another organisation called ArtLink Central to continue that dialogue with that group of practitioners and continue that work. And I think what that process over nearly 2 decades made me realise is change takes an extremely long time, and it really isn't possible without engaging with that core constituency and with those partners. So I think, yeah, we have other examples of engaged practice like that, but I think that's a really strong example for me.
No, absolutely. I'm looking out at all the faces in front of me, and I'm realising there's artists sitting here, there's artist educators, we have museum and gallery professionals, and I suppose in that round, in addressing everyone who's listening and sitting here, can we define values or attributes to an arts educator? What does a person like that who's drawn to this type of work, what does that mean and what do they give?
Yeah, so
it's a tricky one, I know, but
well, I think I'm laughing because at this moment I should just ask you, shouldn't I? Because you know the answer to this question.
Oh, we will definitely ask.
So we at Engage, but actually again in partnership with other amazing organisations, devised a leadership programme nearly 14 years ago. And again, it was actually slightly, in my case, born out of a sense of frustration, I'd say, and irritation, that I could see that there was some amazing leadership work going on within the cultural sector. And I could see that many colleagues were really benefiting from that and progressing, gaining the kind of place within the cultural sector which was going to make a big difference. And I was that felt extraordinary, but I didn't see colleagues who'd chosen to do education and learning work or engagement and participation amongst that group. And I felt that was a real lack. And when I talked to my peers who work in dance and literature and music, they said they saw that too. So we thought we'd do something about that. So we set up the Extend Leadership Programme, which has always been for colleagues who are mid-career, working in engagement participation, but in any field. And we have some alumni here, which is lovely. And the intention of the programme is to support colleagues to progress in the way that they would wish as leaders. But what I think is really wonderful about that is recognising, I think the programme recognises that those working within engagement and participation have brilliant qualities which are in themselves leadership qualities. So of empathy, of the ability to build really impactful partnerships, of collaboration and a recognition of the extraordinary value of this type of work. So work which really does value well-being and thinks about the huge range of human experience, which I think we've been touching on today. So I suppose what I think is that there are some extraordinary qualities that those of us who've chosen to work in this particular field, and I think many people have decided they really want to dedicate the whole professional life to this kind of inquiry, that there's lots and lots of crossover between that and some extraordinary leadership qualities as well. And so through that programme, I think nearly 200 people have now made their way through and have become an alumni group, which is really exciting.
Yeah, no, it's a great programme. It's fantastic. And what kind of links to that, and drawing on maybe what Natasha and Henry looked at this morning, a bit Leela and Allison talked about it, was a word that has kind of occurred to me a lot today was, and I don't know whether other people have felt it, vulnerability was an interesting term that came across, or the allowing yourself to be open and where the creativity can lie in that. What could we say, where does that kind of interface happen, or what can happen for artist educators in that realm with this topic of vulnerability and fragility? I don't know. Does that seem? Is there a place that we can meet that in the middle? Because it's something that was clearly expressed today as something in artist practice.
Yes, exactly. And I think that we were touching on this a little bit at lunchtime, weren't we? That I've been discussing with my board, but because we're a membership organisation, also with our council of members about how engaged might be in the future. And one thing which seems to be a constant preoccupation is the role that an organisation that engaged might have in terms of supporting well-being. So thinking about the well-being of learners, people who are engaging in art and design practice, thinking about the well-being of artists, particularly of artists who work freelance in engagement and participation, who are so precarious, but also thinking about how we can support colleagues who are working within visual arts institutions to be themselves most creative. So I think in order to support people's well-being, you have to acknowledge fragility too.
Yes, and reciprocality came across. I think, I know I'm referencing Henry from earlier this morning, but there was a term that I really liked, the bleed, of where the artist is the educator is the artist, and there was this nice reciprocality of that concept. And I think that has big implications for arts education in itself.
Yes, and I think, I mean, I am one of these people who am quite Pollyanna-ish. I do like to be optimistic. So I suppose I'm very heartened by the current government's interest in creativity. And I suppose one thing I really learned through the Inquire programme, that research programme I was talking about earlier, was how inventive, you all know this, young people and children are, but adults are in terms of creative practice, and how prepared, when we're allowed to be creative, any of us can be in terms of risk-making and experimentation and being playful, and really how uplifting and rewarding that can be. Terrifying as well, but really exciting, I think, too.
Yeah. And I suppose on a personal level for Jane Sillis, what for you is arts learning, arts education? Not so much a definition, but how do you personally define that on the journey you've gone with this organisation and as a practitioner?
Yeah, but I think probably some of those things I just mentioned, that for me, I suppose it's, there are all the things that I actually think are fairly much hardwired into this whole area of practice, whether you call it gallery education or visual arts engagement and participation, as we like to call it now, engage, which is about partnership and collaboration, and being really listening very hard and being prepared to completely change your mind and direction. But I think within that, there's also risk-taking and being prepared to be playful. And I suppose what I think about most of all is that I know that I work in this area because as a young person, I found my engagement with not just the visual arts, but other art forms, the most exciting area of my sort of life, terribly important to my well-being. So I feel really, really, really privileged to still be working within this area of practice with this really generous community. Yeah. That feels terribly important.
Yeah. No, that's a good way to describe it. I don't know, it's also a change of perspective. Like, it's something that I think Frances mentioned, that with Phyllida being the artist and the teacher, and what if we're talking about what does learning actually mean? What does arts learning actually mean? Well, I suppose it's a change of perspective. It's getting people to view the world in a different way, and she certainly did that with her career and with her work. I think we see it every day. Just yesterday, we had a huge school group in here. They certainly left with a different perspective after 3 hours of going through Phyllida's exhibition. So for me, with that group of year 7 and 8s yesterday, that was learning. It was a total world change of perspective for those group of 50 children. So it's, but that's. It is very subjective. It's very personal, but.
And I think that's interesting. We were also talking at lunchtime about how today's really reminded me of how lots of early gallery education practice was very much about making those processes that artists explore and go through, that you were talking about this morning, more visible to anyone, whatever they do in the world. And that is an extraordinary process to be allowed to experience. But I think what's also really exciting is realizing that there are points of contact for nearly everyone, and things that you can draw from that, which is really exciting. And I love the comment that was made this morning about really whatever, everyone has something interesting to say about art, and it can be completely illuminating. Yeah. It's really exciting. Yeah. And so many people, whether they think they're teachers or not, are actually. And that can be, I suppose, resonant just in the way that people operate or create a space or make a work and also in the way that people teach or the pedagogies they use. I think in all of those ways.
Yeah, something that I was reflecting upon from this morning, because I have also taught in university, and something I realized was just opening your studio is a form of teaching, and it makes the artist kind of back into the student role in a way. So I can see why it gets harder and harder to want to do that as further, when you get away from that structure. So the benefit of having the studio here or the residency here was that I was forced to do it with groups of people that wouldn't necessarily come into the studio. And I do think that it would be amazing for secondary schools and other kinds of groups of children and young people to sort of informally go to artist studios, like kind of what the group came and saw me here, but for working artists. Because that I could see, I had to be open to it, and that was the hardest thing for me, only because of my own fears, but actually that was worth more than whatever I was doing in particular. It was just getting to see the studio. Yeah. And so, yeah, it did feel like, oh, that's a blind spot. Like, why doesn't that happen in town or when you're in your own space?
It's really interesting you said that. So we were, again, discussing this at lunchtime. As gallery education was, or this kind of practice was developing in the 70s and 80s, a lot of that early practice was very much about an artist having a studio in a school, and then actually they made work. That was it. Nothing else happened. And then the intention was that students and teachers at the school saw that process, and that process became much more visible just through experiencing it, but also what artists who were involved in that process said, it's very much what you said, in that interchange was really illuminating, and very illuminating, I think, for the teaching staff as well within the school. So I think it's really interesting how that practice was very, very dominant in the 70s and 80s and happened within the formal education sector in a really exciting way, but also it certainly formed the basis of a lot of the work that I did at Icon Gallery, or then I later worked at Whitechapel, which had really privileged that kind of practice. And so that was something I was really excited to continue. And of course, actually, it also was the kind of practice which fed into much of the public art practice which had a consultative aspect, which is sort of runs alongside the development of gallery education, interestingly.
Yes, and it's great on that point of kind of artists being able to engage or see young adults and young students in that space. It's great to see Susie Shamland here, because later this year we will manage to bring a lot of young people to the Frank Bowling studio. So it makes a big difference, and it goes beyond what working in the studio is. It's very much a sense of, well, where is the workspace for young people? Is it on a tablet in their kitchen? Is it in a studio, the artist studio? So it opens up that debate, where does creativity happen? Where is art made? And I think it's great that artists like yourself, Allison, and that Frank's studio are really keen to foster that and kind of do that with the learning team here for Hauser Wirth. I noticed, yes, Natasha.
It was less a question and maybe more a kind of call for something. I guess I was just thinking back to the moment of kind of graduating, and I went straight to the Chisenhale to work on an amazing project where, there were 10 artists employed to work in 10 schools, and it was called Get Art, and it was amazing. And we were all given a school to work in, an amazing teacher to work with, and amazing group of young people with specific learning differences. And what I was interested in as I was listening was, it was the most generous space, because the Chisenhale opened its doors to the show of our work with those young people. And there was training, and there was dialogue about our practices, and there was a community of other artists. And we were learning and making. So it was a way to keep being an artist post-graduation, like the most generous. And then I went to I was really lucky to be part of those like spaces then, from the Chisenhale to the Whitechapel to Camden Arts Centre, like how super. And there was really unbelievable models. And I guess I was just thinking about now, our graduates now, and because what they did was they provided further training, they gave us a kind of community of other practitioners who I continue working with, and in a sense they gave they gave a way into the gallery that had, for us as well. And they kind of became another type of studio, like the gallery, those learning spaces. They were like kind of studios, our studios. And I suppose I was just thinking of how unbelievably privileged we were to be in that moment, whenever it was. I don't even want to think about the dates.
No, it was the 90s.
Yeah, it was the 90s. But what about now? What about our graduates now? Because those they really were phenomenal. So what do we do about now? We need to kind of look back at some of those models. I know you're doing your PhD in that, but and talk about them, but we need them now for our graduates, because actually they're communities, they're extensions of studios, their way to keep being a kind of artist.
Yeah, no, I really agree. So I think one thing we've noticed is, particularly since the pandemic, that as students graduate, they really, really do need support. It doesn't seem to be very evident, and I think that's something interestingly and rather depressingly, it's an issue which is impacting young people in Wales, Scotland and England. So we're really keen to develop some training and support and some peer support for that group of young people as they graduate, and I suppose to encourage them to believe that they can work in this area, and to somehow show the way into that work. So, and I think it's really interesting you talk about the Chisenhale experience. So I can remember, set up by Emily Prinkle. What was really interesting, who's written a lot about this area of work, what I thought was really interesting was that work was supported by the art advisor in Tower Hamlets, a structure which is, eroded, that doesn't exist any longer. They were pivotal, actually, in terms of supporting it. Really, really important component in all of that. And the other thing I thought was extraordinary is the way the work was shown. So it looked completely different. It didn't look like an exhibition or work by children and young people. It looked like an artist. It looked like a collection of artist installations, and it was brilliant. So really fabulous. But I think it's taking all of that and seeing, I mean, there are lots of organisations doing fabulous work. I was just having an email exchange this morning with Keppel's Yard in Cambridge, who are doing something really similar right now. So it's just knowing where those places are and signposting them, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jane. It's kind of really nice to you've been here today and to kind of give us that level of experience and insight over the really that rich history of Engage. And thank you for your feedback as well on that. I think it kind of pulls together a lot of what's happened over the course of today. There is this circular idea around arts education. A lot of the same issues keep recurring and keep coming up. But I think on that time-wise, I'll hand back to Dea to kind of finish off our day.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jane and Alan. I guess just to take sort of a minute before we sort of release you, and I can just feel all the different ideas and conversations and questions that will sort of happen in this room. So I will keep it brief. But just thinking back on the day and sort of seeing a few people feverishly taking notes, including me, what have we learned? We've learned to encourage each other to step into each other's behaviors, perhaps talk honestly and see where that takes us, to catch and collect coincidences, to ask the right people, teachers, how to sort of engage with children, and artists, sort of what sort of experience would you like out of residencies? Treasuring and using waste, to keeping curiosity at the core. So hopefully, you'll keep all these things with you as within your conversations. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, all of our speakers, Natasha, Henry, Allison, Leela, Tanya, Frances, Jane, and Alan. A huge thank you to the teams here in Somerset and as well in London, and obviously the wider kind of different departments that have all supported and made today very possible. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself to Alan and also Eleanor, who form our UK learning team here. And we're also delighted to have Noisika Sanchez here, who leads the learning department at Chilida Lecus. Perhaps Noisika, put up your hand so they know who you are. Perfect. Thank you all so much for coming. And as part of the celebration, we have a gift for you all, a special edition poster to celebrate our learning anniversary. We hope you will continue to come on this journey with us, and thank you for being part of it. Just to also remind, the shuttle to Castlecarry leaves promptly at 4 o'clock. But before that, I welcome you to grab a drink at the back, enjoy meeting and sharing ideas. For anyone who'd like to go and visit the exhibition, it will be open till 5 o'clock. And yes, that's it. Enjoy.